Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be going to what if the Asshole Pirates did not split part 6. Make sure to like and subscribe, it helps, and it means the world to me. Also join the Discord. Disclaimer. There may be mature content and maybe 18 plus content, and I don't own this story, and link to the author down below. Go check them out. With that stuff out of the way, let's begin chapter 51. The Hunt for Vander Decken. The next day after breakfast the brothers were given the okay by Marco to go exploring, so long as they come straight back if they needed any help. The brothers agreed, and just like that, the search for Vander Decken commenced. Sabo was listening intently to their surroundings, waiting for even a hint of Vander Decken's name to be mentioned. Ace was scanning their surroundings, and seeing as he didn't know what the man looked like, opted for looking for any suspicious-looking people. Luffy, much like Ace, couldn't smell right with all of this water around them, so he opted to do what he did best, and scan for any bad auras that would indicate a bad person. The three searched a lot longer than they would have preferred, the time nearing lunch before they caught a hint of anything. They had ventured a bit closer to the edge of the bubble when Sabo heard talking off in the water, much further away from Fishman Island, located more in the depths of the ocean. It had been a brief noise, so far away that it was even hard for Sabo to hear, but he swore someone had said Decken. Seeing as this was the closest they'd gotten to any clues about the man's whereabouts, Sabo shushed his brothers who had started an argument on whether it would be appropriate to eat the fish swimming outside the bubble or not. I think I heard someone out there talking about Decken, Sabo whispered, more focused on listening rather than the words he was saying. This shut his brothers up immediately, letting Sabo listen. They stayed silent, and Sabo could hear the murmuring in the distance. Being unable to hear the words frustrated the blonde, and after having searched this long even his patience was wearing thin. I can't make out what they're saying, but I know I heard someone say Decken out there, Sabo said to his brothers. Being so close to a clue, yet so far frustrated the blonde more than he would like to admit. Where'd you hear the talking? Ace asked, looking around at the different fishermen and women roaming around them. Sabo shook his head, grabbing Ace's shoulder and turning him to look outside the bubble they were in. It wasn't here on the island, it was out there, he said, pointing off into the distance. Ace and Luffy frowned at that, the youngest squinting in an attempt to see something, while Ace used his enhanced vision to take a look. Oh? I don't see anything out there, anyone. It's just a bunch of fish, some correlate giant. Oh, I see a ship. Ace said with a grin, excitement rising in him at the prospect of actually finding the man they were most likely going to fight. Then let's go, Luffy said happily, nearly charging right at the bubble. Before he had a chance to though, Sabo stopped him. Now hold on, how exactly are we going to get over there? Not only do we have to somehow get through this bubble, but we also have to get through the next bubble surrounding this one. Also, did you two fail to remember that that's water out there, and you're both devil fruit users? And not to mention we're hundreds, maybe thousands, of feet under the water. I'm not a superhuman, that kind of pressure would kill me, Sabo said, arms folded over his chest as he frowned at his overeager brothers. Ace frowned in annoyance, mimicking Sabo's stance and folding his arms as well. What are we supposed to do then? I'm not just gonna let the crybaby princess stay in that room the rest of her life because of some stupid water, Ace said, Luffy nodding his agreeance. Yeah, me neither, Luffy shouted. This caused Sabo to sigh, knowing just as well as his brothers that none of them wanted to let that happen. And you think I do? This just means we have to figure out how we're going to get out there without drowning. Not only that, but we also have to figure out how to get out there in the first place, Sabo said, eyeing the protective bubble around them. Why don't we just walk through it? Luffy asked, Ace nodding as he obviously thought the same thing. Sabo took a deep breath, trying to stay patient, knowing that sometimes his brothers weren't the brightest. The bubbles are tough, remember? And that was just a bubble around the ship. I have no doubt that this giant bubble surrounding the island would be much tougher and harder to get through. Not only that, but there's another bubble around this one, meaning that even if we manage to get out of this one, we'd still have to get out the other, Sabo explained, pushing his hand on the bubble to prove his point that it wouldn't go through so easy. So we just need something to push us out, right? Ace asked, and Sabo couldn't stop the slightly frustrated sigh that left his lips then. Ace, were you not listening? We'd need a lot of force behind us to get us through this, Sabo said, gesturing once more to the giant bubble. Ace pouted and crossed his arms, also becoming annoyed. Of course I was listening. I was just thinking, what about Luffy's rocket? Couldn't that get us through? Ace asked, and suddenly the frustration and impatience left Sabo as he felt slightly guilty about getting mad at his brother when he was only trying to help. Oh, well, that might work, but it would probably only get us through one of the layers if we were lucky, and then we'd still be stuck in the second layer, where Luffy wouldn't have anything to grab onto to rocket us. It was a good thought though, Sabo said, giving his brother a slightly apologetic smile. It went silent again as they thought about their options, and soon it became obvious to them that they didn't have many. We can't use the entrance. I doubt the guards would just let us walk out there, even if we are Whitebeards, we're still kids. Not to mention, it would be weird if we left Fishman Island and came back with Vander Decken. Sabo said, thinking out loud as he began pacing back and forth, trying to think up a solution. What about the guys that are leaving? Luffy asked, looking over at something. Confused, his brothers looked as well and saw that there was a small group of fishermen loading up a relatively small boat, looking to be heading out. Well, that could work, but what about the whole drowning thing? Sabo asked, watching the men carefully. Bubbly coral. Luffy provided happily, holding up their bubbly coral proudly, and Sabo felt a bit dumb for having forgotten about the wonderful piece of technology. Why can't you be this smart all the time? Ace asked, a smile on his face as he took the coral from his brother. Luffy, expectedly, pouted at the insult, but Sabo didn't give them time to argue. If we're doing this then we have to go now, the boat's about ready to leave, Sabo said, hearing some fishermen calling that everything was loaded and they were ready to go. Faces serious now, Ace and Luffy both nodded, and the trio headed to the ship, glancing around to make sure no one was watching them too closely. It was relatively easy to sneak onto the boat, all they had to do was silently follow the last guy up the gangplank, and disappear from sight before anyone saw them. Apparently, the crew wasn't worried about stowaways because no one looked for them, and no one expected them to be there. It was all too simple to slip off to the many stacks of boxes and barrels and hide behind them. It just so happened that their hiding spot was right beside the railing as well, giving them a perfect escape route. The ship began to disembark, so Sabo took the opportunity to use the bubbly coral to surround him and his brothers in a bubble. With that done, all they had to do was wait and hope no one managed to stumble upon them. The ride out was quick and easy, the ship leaving through the entrance they had entered with the day before, and before they knew it, they were jumping off the boat and out of the protective coating around it, leaving them alone in the depths of the ocean. Alright Ace, now's a good time to use that supervision of yours and guide us to Vander Decken, Sabo said as he looked around blindly for the ship Ace had seen, but having no luck in finding it. Ace nodded and glanced around for it, probably finding it somewhere over to their left. It's over there, a bit away, but it shouldn't take too long to get to it. Come on, Ace said, and the three began to make their way over to the ship, slowly but steadily. Can you see anyone on the ship? Sabo asked, wanting to know what they were up against. Being out in the ocean now, everything sounded a bit muffled to him. He could still hear things, like the people on the ship, but he couldn't make out what they were saying as easily as normal, or figure out how many different voices there were. Yeah, a pretty good bunch of people. I think it's a pirate ship. Hey, is this Decken guy a pirate or something? Ace asked, noticing the skull waving proudly on the black flag. I don't know, Princess Shirahashi never mentioned it, Sabo said with a shrug, not caring if this man was a pirate or king. We get to beat up some pirates. Cool. Luffy cheered happily, arms stretching out above him and in turn stretching the bubble. Why don't we be a bit more careful, Lou? I'd rather not test this bubble's limits while we're depending on it to keep us all from dying, Sabo said, sweat dropping as he gently lowered Luffy's arms. Isn't it supposed to be pretty tough? Besides, we're about to find out soon seeing as we have to fight these guys, and they don't look like they're using a bubble around their ship. Ace said, squinting to get a better look. Sabo sighed in defeat, knowing his brother was right, and hoping that the bubble would hold up. Really, they should have planned this better, or at least have tested the bubble to see how tough it was, but it was too late to turn back now, and there was no way they were going back empty-handed. Soon enough, the brothers reached the ship, the Flying Dutchman according to his sails, and it was easy to just swim right onto the deck, seeing as there was nothing stopping them. Try hockey. Sabo tapped quickly before anyone noticed they were there. Ace nodded, and while he blasted the Fishman in front of them, Sabo used the bubbly coral to give the brothers their own separate bubbles, allowing them to move more freely. The hockey clearly affected most of the pirates, a lot of them falling to the ground foaming at the mouth. Meanwhile, a few kneeled at the pressure, and one remained standing, only stumbling a bit. When they had reached the ship, Sabo had been able to make out the talking much clearer, and if he had to guess, the one standing was Decken according to the many, now fallen, pirates. He also seemed to be the captain of this crew as well. Though the man was definitely a Fishman, he had a bubble around him as well, confusing the brothers. Couldn't Fishman breathe underwater? Why would he have a bubble around him if he could supposedly breathe just fine like his crew around them? And then Sabo remembered the fact that Vander Decken supposedly had a devil fruit. It was strange that the sea would affect even a Fishman, but Sabo knew not to question the mysterious powers of the fruit. Oh? And who are you? Vander Decken asked, eyeing the three brothers with a raised eyebrow and a frown. Seeing as most of his crew was down on the floor, and they hadn't even touched anyone yet meant that one of them had the third rare hockey, something Decken knew to be wary of. Even so, they were just kids. We're here to ask you to stop sending Princess Shirahashi weapons to her door, Sabo said with a polite smile, knowing full well the man wasn't going to stop just because they asked. So Shirahashi sent you then? No matter, I will have the princess marry me. Her beauty is meant only for me, and if she can't accept it then she will just have to die. Decken announced, his crewmates nodding their agreement and cheering their captain on, all getting ready to fight. As you can see, I wouldn't be stopping anytime soon, and there's nothing three kids can do to make me change my mind. the captain said smugly, crossing his arms over his chest. All of the brothers smiled now, Ace and Luffy cracking their knuckles in anticipation, while Sabo tilted his head. Actually, I think there is. The blonde said matter-of-factly. At that moment one of the fishermen seemed to notice the symbol on their wristbands, their eyes going wide. See Captain, there with the W white beards. The fisherman stuttered, pointing to the emblem. The entire crew's eyes went wide, even Deccan's. What? But they're just a bunch of kids. Decken shouted in surprise, the brothers' smiles never faltering for a second. No matter, we can take them on and let their bodies sink to the seafloor. That old man will never know what happened to him. Hear that? Let's get him. Vander Decken shouted, pointing to the brothers. The few remaining crew members cheered and rushed forward toward the three. Luffy and I can handle the mace, you go get Decken, Sabo said, knowing the eldest would be best suited to fight the captain. He was always the strongest out of them, though he would never admit that out loud to him. Ace's grin turned malicious as he nodded, fists formed as he rushed toward the captain, his brothers following to stop anyone who would get in the way. Ah, but I wanted to fight him. Luffy whined as he easily punched a man that had tried to swing their sword at him. I'm older, so that means I get the bigger fish. Ace shouted, sticking his tongue out at Luffy as he ran past the crew and towards Decken, leaving his brothers to fight. No fair. Luffy pouted, knocking another two fishermen out with his whip, flinging them into the side of the cabin. If we hurry up here we can join Ace in beating him up, Sabo said with a smile, as he knocked the many legs out from under an octopus fishman, the man falling to the ground where Sabo stomped on his chest. The man wheezed in pain, and Sabo kicked him to the side as he took on another two fishermen who tried converging on him. Jumping into the air water. He dodged the swipes of their swords and kicked the back of one of them, sending him flying into his crewmate and launching them into the same man Luffy had kicked into the cabin wall. Yosh. I'm gonna beat 'em all up. Luffy cheered, knocking two heads together. Sabo and Luffy were doing fairly well, watching each other's backs, so neither got a cut or scratch on them. Within minutes they were done and they felt nice and warmed up. It had been a while since they had been able to fight, and it felt nice to get the exercise, especially for Luffy. He hadn't been able to stretch his limbs that far in a long time, and it felt amazing. It was a good thing that none of the fishermen had a chance to notice the boys' devil fruit before they were knocked out. Turning to look at how Ace was faring, they saw that it was an easily one-sided fight with Ace being the obvious victor. Decken was covered in bruises, and his face was already beginning to swell from how hard Ace had punched him. Sabo couldn't help but chuckle at how overboard Ace had gone while Luffy was pouting again, mumbling that he wanted to fight Dell too. If you wanted to fight him you should have beaten the others quicker. Ace said, having heard Luffy's complaints. There wasn't a single scratch on Ace either, and he wasn't even out of breath from the fight. I thought these guys were supposed to be strong, Sabo said, nudging Decken's motionless hand with his foot in slight disappointment. Either the brothers were much stronger than they had thought, or these guys were much weaker than average. Wasn't that strong to me? Ace said, slightly annoyed that the captain hadn't put up much of a fight. In the middle of the man boasting about how strong he was and how weak Ace was, Ace had sent a fiery fist at the man's face and knocked him out instantly. All the other punches were Ace venting his pent-up frustrations. So what now? The eldest asked, crossing his arms and looking to the blonde. Well, we bring him back, he said with a shrug, lifting the unconscious captain and putting him on his back, getting ready to make the swim back to Fishman Island. Just like that? Ace asked with a raised eyebrow. Well, yeah, there's not much else we can do, Sabo said as he walked to the railing of the ship, his brothers following. But I thought we had to hide how strong we were, Luffy said in confusion, tilting his head. Sabo nodded, jumping off the railing and beginning to swim back. You're right, we do, that's why we're going to fib about how we defeated Decken. Ace, lead us back to the entrance, Sabo said, and Ace mindlessly got to the front and began leading the way. How are we going to explain the very obvious wounds? Ace asked, his eyebrow raised. Well, this definitely would have been easier if you hadn't made it so obvious that someone attacked him, but I expected you to do something like this, so I already had a story ready. Don't worry, it'll be fine, Sabo said, moving Decken a bit to make it easier to swim while carrying him. They didn't speak after that, Ace and Luffy trusting that Sabo would handle things as they came. It took a bit longer to get to the entrance, seeing as they were just swimming back, but eventually, they made it. And as Sabo anticipated, the voice of the guards inside boomed out to them through speakers. What are you three doing out there? They asked, clearly baffled by the three teens making their way to the island. Well, we found something that you might want to come take care of, Sabo said, nudging his shoulder that Decken's head was resting on, giving them a view of the fishman's beaten appearance. Is that oi, called the royal palace? Tell them some kids got Vander Decken. The noise coming from the speakers suddenly became frantic as there was chaos inside, all the guards moving as fast as they could to get the message to the palace. You three just stay there, the royal highness will be by soon. The voice said eventually to them, and Sabo nodded, the brothers getting comfy as they waited. So far so good. Ace said, arms crossed as he looked at the giant entrance. Sabo nodded. Yeah, let's just hope it stays that way, Sabo said. Sure, he had a plan, an explanation for all of this, but even so, it was a bit far-fetched. However, there would be no other way of explaining how they managed to take down the infamous Vander Decken, without telling them they had attacked and defeated him and his entire crew. I think everything's going to be okay. Sabo's smart. Luffy said in reassurance, most likely having picked up on all the nervousness coming from both Ace and Sabo. The two oldest smiled at him and nodded. Yeah, you're right Lu, there's nothing to worry about. Ace agreed, nodding his head. Luffy felt the nervousness seemingly melt away from his brothers as they calmed down, Luffy's words having helped them immensely. It was always strange to the two older brothers how Luffy could seemingly calm their emotions if he tried, no matter how anxious or scared they were. Minutes ticked by slowly, and after about 20 minutes had passed the guard announced that Neptune was there. The man was on his giant whale, arms crossed and face serious as they came out into the ocean with the brothers. You got Vander Decken, Jamin? He asked skeptically. We did your highness, Sabo said, swimming up to the king with his brothers, and handing the defeated captain over. Neptune's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not having expected it to be true, but now that he was seeing it, he was speechless. I don't know what to say, he trailed off, staring at the unconscious man sitting in front of him. Thank you. You've done a great service to this island. Come, we must get back to the palace at once. I'll send for the Whitebeards to join us, Jamin. Neptune said, his joy and relief exuding from him in waves, making Luffy fill with joy and relief in response. The brothers were ushered onto the whale and then were brought back into Fishman Island, where they headed straight for Ryuga Palace. As they got close, Sabo could hear the guards inside, whispering about rumors they'd heard that Vander Decken had been defeated, but the second they actually reached the palace and went inside, everyone grew silent, standing tall and faces void of emotion. The brothers and Neptune got off of the whale, Neptune holding Vander Decken, and the trio followed the king as he walked up to the ministers and a few guards. Tossing Vander Decken over to the guards, he gave them a serious look. Lock him up, Jamin, and make sure there's no way he can get out. He said to the guards, who saluted and grabbed the man, quickly rushing to the prison cells. So the rumors are true then? Minister of the Right said as he watched Vander Decken disappear from sight. Neptune nodded, a smile blossoming once more. They are. Thanks to our friends here, Shirahashi should finally be safe from Decken's advances, Jamin. Neptune cheered happily, the ministers smiling as well in relief. Then you have our eternal gratitude. Minister of the Left said, bowing to the brothers who didn't quite know how to react to the attention, especially since the Whitebeards weren't there yet. You know, it was nothing, Sabo said, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. At that moment there was a ringing from a snail phone, which one of the ministers promptly moved to, answering it. It was a princess, who the brothers had yet to meet, saying they had arrived with the Whitebeards. The minister opened the channel for them to get in, and the group waited in silence for the pirates to arrive. Oh, Ace, Sabo, Luffy, you're here too. Thatch asked as he, Marco, Haruta, and Namor walked in, the three princes trailing in behind them. The brothers only waved to the pirates in response as Marco looked up at Neptune. What was the purpose of calling us all here, Yuri? He asked. Luffy could feel that he was a bit worried, but mostly curious, and Luffy could tell the worry was directed toward the brothers. Did he think they were in trouble? Why, for a celebration, of course, Jamin. Neptune said cheerily, smile wide on his face. A celebration? For what? Haruta asked, also confused, along with the other commanders. Well, it would seem your new recruits are quite amazing indeed. They managed to find and defeat Vander Decken, Jamin. Neptune said, the smile never leaving his face. The commanders all became wide-eyed, turning to look at the brothers in astonishment. You defeated Vander Decken? Namor asked. They had all heard about the man, he was the reason for keeping the princess locked away all this time, but they hadn't been able to find him anywhere on the island whenever they were around. Well, not exactly, Sabo said, beginning to lie. I'm sure they can recount the story at the feast. Minister of the Right said, ushering the group into the dining hall they had been in previously where there was once again a feast being held. Luffy's mouth watered at the memory of how good yesterday's feast had been, and he and Ace immediately rushed to sit down, Sabo following at a much more average pace. As food was passed around and everyone became settled, all eyes were on the brothers, everyone wanting to know just what had happened. To be honest, Ace and Luffy were curious as well, their eyes turning to Sabo as they waited for him to begin explaining. I guess I'll start from the beginning. My brothers and I were walking around Fishman Island, and we got close to the docks where we saw someone outside the bubbles who looked to be drowning. We asked one of the leaving merchants to take us out there, and used the bubbly coral to swim over, and saw that it was Vander Decken, which confused us because he's a fishman. Sabo began, and he could already see that everyone was listening with rapt attention, the Whitebeards especially. So we pulled him into our bubble, and he started muttering random things like Shirahashi and how he was going to marry her, and he said his own name too, which is how we knew who he was. When we got lost here yesterday we heard some people talking about the mermaid princess, and how she was confined to her room because of Decken, so we knew he was a bad guy, and before he regained his senses, Ace started hitting him a couple of times. Sabo said with a shrug as if it wasn't a big deal. After he seemed to be incapacitated, we brought him back to the entrance where the guards called King Neptune, and they imprisoned him. Sabo finished, eating calmly to keep up the rouse that their story was true. Everyone seemed to buy the story, and a check with Luffy proved that no one was suspicious of them. Magnificent. Thank you for the service you've done to the kingdom, it can never be repaid, Jamin. Neptune said, his smile never leaving his face the entire time. Really, it was no problem, we didn't even do that much, Sabo said, holding his hands up as he shook his head. It may not seem that way, but the entire kingdom has been looking for Decken for years. To think he was outside the bubble this entire time. Fukabashi spoke up finally, his brothers nodding their agreement beside him. Yes, why don't you and your brothers go get Shirahashi? I'm sure she would like to finally come out of her room and meet her saviors, Jamin. Neptune said to the princes, who nodded and immediately headed toward the tower Shirahashi was in. Everyone began finishing up their meals and began heading back to the main hall of the palace. You don't think that crybaby princess is going to give us away, do you? Ace asked as they followed Marco and Thatch closely. I don't think so, after all, we did help her as we promised. Sabo said, also a bit nervous that she would, whether on purpose or not. I don't think she will, Shibahashi's a good person. Luffy replied confidently. Yeah, that's true. Also, is Shirahashi you too? Especially here in the palace you have to call her by her actual name, not Crybaby, and not Shibahashi, got it? Sabo asked sternly, knowing his brothers were stubborn about things like that. Yeah, whatever. Ace replied, and Sabo just had to hope the eldest would listen. Even though Sabo had just warned Ace about his name calling, he could already hear said princess heading their way, tears and sobs, already making their way to his enhanced senses. Ah, Shirahashi. Neptune greeted as the giant mermaid entered the hall, her brothers following close behind. Father, is it true? Shirahashi asked, looking towards the brothers for only a second before looking back to the king. Her tears, as expected, were falling fast and hard. It is, these three brought Vander Decken here themselves, Jamin, Neptune said, gesturing to the brothers. Sabo and Luffy were smiling to the princess, while Ace looked as if he was uninterested, though he was a bit antsy at all the sudden attention they were now getting. Really? Thank you. Shirahashi thanked loudly, banging her head to the brothers gratefully. That's not necessary, we didn't do that much, princess. It's a pleasure to meet you, I'm Sabo, and these are my brothers, Ace and Luffy. Sabo said, pointing out his brothers to the princess, regardless of the fact that she already knew them, and bowed, making sure Ace and Luffy did the same. It's nice to meet you as well, I'm Princess Shirahashi. She returned, a smile widening happily on her face, even as her tears continued to fall rapidly. Shirahashi, my daughter, thanks to these three, from this day forth, you can finally leave your room freely without worry, Jamin, Neptune said happily, tears of his own forming in his eyes, though they didn't fall. Shirahashi didn't respond, instead, she wiped her tears, which didn't do much to help, and nodded. I'm sleepy. Luffy said as he yawned, stretching his arms above him, though controlling how far they went. The group of Whitebeards and honorary Whitebeards were heading back to the ship for the night, the sky nearly completely dark now. Don't worry Lou, we can go to bed once we're back at the ship, Sabo said, patting Luffy's back. I still can't believe you three managed to mangle Decken's face up that much. Thatch said, still amazed. The Whitebeards had gone and visited Vander Decken before they left to make sure the guards didn't have trouble locking him up, but mostly because they wanted to see with their own eyes that their defenseless, traumatized trio had managed to take down a man that had evaded them for years. Well, after we heard from the guards about how Shirahashi had been kept in her room for years, we weren't exactly big fans of the guy. When we figured out who it was, Ace went a little overboard, and I wasn't going to stop him, so I let him. Sabo said with a shrug. Ace crossed his arms, frowning a bit as he remembered how easy it was to take the man down. He really had been hoping for a more entertaining fight. He was a bastard. Ace said matter-of-factly, Luffy nodding his agreement. The Whitebeards watched the brothers for a second, suddenly remembering that, though not quite in the same way, they had been locked up for years against their will. All of a sudden, they wished they had been able to punch the guy a few times. I'm glad that everything went well in the end, Yoi, Marco said, face giving no indication on his emotions. Sabo was just thankful that he hadn't been mad about them leaving the island. Chapter 52. Expanding Trust. Luffy jolted upright, eyes blown open wide and sweat on his forehead. Ace and Sabo both sighed in relief that the youngest had finally woken up, having been stuck in another nightmare. It hadn't lasted too long, not like the other times, only about 5 minutes, but it was still terrifying nonetheless. You're right Lou, no one's gonna hurt you now. Ace murmured as he hugged Luffy to him. Sabo scooted closer, placing his hand on Luffy's shoulder. Yeah, Ace is right, we're here on the Moby Dick, remember? With Marco and Whitebeard, trustworthy people, right? Sabo asked, trying to calm the youngest, remind him that he was here with people he trusted rather than people he feared. Marco and Whitebeard. And Thatch and Izo too? Luffy asked, much to his brother's confusion. He asked about them the same way he asked about Marco and Whitebeard, so did that mean he trusted them as much as the first two? They'd known for a while that they could possibly trust Atch, but this just confirmed it. Not to mention, they hadn't spent much time around Izo, and now Luffy was speaking as if they could trust him as well. The list of people they trusted was beginning to grow, and the two older brothers didn't know if that was a good or a bad thing. Yeah, even Thatch and Izo. Ace said, unsure of how he felt about the two. So far they had been trustworthy, and even helpful, but that didn't always mean someone was a good person, maybe it was all an act. That always seemed to be Ace's go-to answer though, that everyone around them was acting. If they were acting, they were masters at it, and they weren't dropping the act anytime soon. But in reality, how realistic was it that an entire ship's full of pirates were able to all act as well as these pirates had? Not to mention, be so well coordinated as well. If everyone here was acting, the brothers would have picked right up on any slip-ups that they made, but there was nothing. No one sending them suspicious looks when they thought they weren't watching, no one whispering in the dead of night in the catacombs that were the Moby Dick, no one sending them off with Marines when they had the chance. As much as it made Ace relieved, it also made him suspicious, because these were pirates after all. If their goal truly was to help the brothers, then why were they labeled as such bad people? Sabo and Ace both knew that these were pirates known around the world, pirates that everyone always labeled as dangerous and heartless, but here they were helping traumatized children that they knew nothing about. Not to mention, they had agreed to stay with these pirates. Ace was sure that he had given up on all these suspicions when he agreed to stay, when he agreed that everyone here, minus Teach, was worth getting to know, worth trusting. Yet here he was, reverting back to his normal, suspicious self. Man, he was a mess. See, can we go eat? Luffy asked, blinking a few times as he unknowingly, or maybe even knowingly, drove Ace's self-deprecating thoughts away. Yeah, of course, Lou, let's go. They just finished making breakfast a few minutes ago. Sabo said, gently maneuvering Luffy off the bed and towards the door, Ace getting up a bit slower than usual, as he tried processing all the many thoughts running through his head. Surely these were just good people, mislabeled as something they weren't by a world of self-righteous bastards. After all, they had done the same to him the second he was born, before then even. Before he had even taken his first breath, his first thought, before his eyes had ever opened once, he was labeled as a monster, one that was condemned to die. I love you, Ace, Luffy said, grabbing the eldest's hand suddenly, and all the anger, rage, hatred, it all melted away in an instant. Ace looked into his brother's eyes, amazed once again by Luffy's ease at which he could calm all of Ace's emotions with just a few words. Rolling his eyes, Ace nodded, squeezing the hand in his. Yeah, whatever, Ace muttered, ignoring the rising heat in his cheeks as he said so. He never was good at showing his emotions, especially the gooey ones that Sabo made fun of him for. Even though he didn't say it, he knew his brothers knew what he meant, what he felt. Sabo only watched with a peaceful smile, one that didn't show a hint of teasing in it. Ace was immensely grateful that, if anything had to happen at the facility, they were all given powers that would help keep each other safe, ones that they desperately needed to survive in this unfair world. Come on, I think they're beginning to wonder where we're at, Sabo said, turning around to leave the room now, Ace and Luffy in tow behind him. Those bastards can wait a few minutes for us, Ace said, though there was no heat behind his words, because he was finally beginning to warm up to these people, finally beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe the Marines had mislabeled these people just as they had done to him. Sabo seemed to pick up on Ace's thoughts because his smile widened as he eyed Ace. The blonde nodded, turning to face forward again, while Ace continued holding Luffy's hand, ignoring any more thoughts that wanted to slither into his mind, about how he should have never been born. He had people now that needed him to protect them, people who loved him. There was no way in hell he was going to let those thoughts of self-doubt and self-deprecation weigh him down now, not when he had brothers who relied on him, brothers who reminded him time and time again that they loved him, regardless of his parentage. So are you three going to the island again today? Thatch asked as he served himself his breakfast, sitting in front of the three brothers who were already chowing down. Ace and Luffy were nearing the end of their first serving, while Sabo was eating at a much more manageable pace, not even halfway through his slightly larger than normal size meal. Thinking about the chef's question had Sabo wondering the same thing himself. He and his brothers hadn't discussed whether they would want to go explore again today or not. Normally Sabo would say that, yes, of course, they were going, because after being trapped in a dark cell for 7 years, any chance they had to go explore the outside world they would gladly take. Today, however, was different. Luffy's nightmare was still fresh in the youngest's mind, if his slight fidgeting and flickering eyes were anything to go by, and that would probably deter him from wanting to go exploring. Even with how much they knew he loved and wanted to explore, they knew just as well that one bad nightmare could ruin their day, whether they wanted it to or not. Glancing over to the youngest and taking in the tense frame of his brother, Sabo's lips thinned. Ace was watching Luffy closely as well as he kept an eye on the rest of the galley, making sure that their brother didn't suddenly go into a panic attack anytime soon. Was it a good idea to go out today? One wrong word, one wrong image, and Luffy would be thrown into a panic attack that they would all like to avoid. If they stayed here on the Mobi, where they were all coming to terms with the fact that it was safe, they would be at a much less likelihood of running into anything that would trigger unwanted memories. However, as Sabo was examining Luffy, the Raven's eyes flitted over to his, and he grinned. It wasn't as big as normal, nor as bright, but it was enough to tell the blonde that he wanted to go, regardless of what could happen. It didn't sit well with Sabo that Luffy would be put at risk, but he didn't want to force his baby brother to stay cooped up on a ship, no matter how big it was, not after all they'd been through. So, with a bit of hesitance and a frown from Ace, Sabo turned back over to look at Thatch, who was waiting expectantly for the brother's answer. "Yeah, I think we will," he said with a tight smile. As much as he wanted to go, he didn't want to put his brother in any situations that could possibly harm him, physically or mentally, and going out today had a lot of potential for the latter. "That's great. I've got a free day today and was hoping to go with you three. We haven't been able to hang out all that much since you've been here," Thatch said with a friendly smile, and Luffy could feel the joy coming from the chef at the prospect that he would be joining the brothers today. It made him feel a bit better about the idea of leaving the ship today, his nightmare still flashing through his mind, the memory of it keeping him on a constant edge. The joy from the chef pushed those thoughts away easier, and Luffy had to keep himself from letting all of the emotion in, knowing he could easily become influenced by it. Not to mention, Luffy had wanted to hang out with Thatch more as well. After recently deciding that Marco and Whitebeard were both trustworthy people, Luffy was slowly becoming more sure of the pirates that they were constantly with. Thatch had been there when they were rescued, he was there when Luffy willingly went back to the facility, he was there when Luffy found his brothers, and he had kept his promises. All of these made Luffy truly believe that the chef was also someone they could trust, but he was still a bit unsure. He wanted to be 100% sure of it before mentioning to his brothers that they could trust him. The same could be said for Izo, who Luffy could see watching them from where he sat a few seats away. Although he hadn't been there from the beginning like Marco and Thatch had, he had been there to reassure Luffy that his brothers would be okay, and had tried his best to keep him calm, when Luffy didn't know whether trusting these people to help his brothers was a good idea or not. He had also helped him with his hat issue, keeping it from flying away ever again, thanks to the string that was securely fastened around his neck. It wasn't often that they hung around Izo though, the last time having been the tour that he gave them, but even that had been cut short, and they never went back to finish it after that. Deciding that he would try and do something to remedy that later, Luffy returned to his meal, finishing his first serving with ease and beginning his second, Ace close behind. Sabo was continuing the conversation with Thatch, discussing where they could go for the day. It was briefly mentioned that Marco would be joining them as well, the man having joined the conversation and bringing up the brothers' excursion yesterday, mentioning he didn't want them to get into any trouble they couldn't get out of. Sabo had agreed, and it made Luffy feel better that they would be going with someone he knew for sure he could trust. As they all finished up their breakfast, Ace and Luffy eating a good 3 large servings, the group headed out to the deck. Marco headed off to Whitebeard to tell the captain about their outing for the day, while the brothers and Thatch waited by the railing for the first commander. "Is there anything you guys want to go do and see while we're on the island? I know that you went exploring yesterday, but I don't know how much you saw seeing as you got distracted," Thatch said, remembering the fact that they had taken down Vander Decken. Sabo thought about it, knowing that despite the fact they had thoroughly searched the island for the villain, they hadn't actually explored. They had been more focused on finding any hint of Decken, rather than looking at any cool stores. "I don't know, we don't really know what's out there. It would be nice to look at a few shops though," Sabo mentioned, knowing that he and his brothers were always content with window shopping. Luffy would probably ask to buy something, the youngest had an odd fondness for trinkets and such, but other than that it would be nice to just wander around and sightsee. Thatch nodded at that, turning to look towards Fishman Island with a smile, leaning against the railing. "Shops, huh? There's definitely a lot of those that we can go look at," Thatch said enthusiastically, causing Sabo to smile. He wondered if this was what it was like for Luffy whenever he felt strong emotions, to become influenced by them. This being near the happy chef made Sabo feel more happy and energetic, as well as if it was contagious. "Ready to go, Yuri?" Marco suddenly asked, walking back up to the group and shaking Sabo from his musings. "Yup. Clear everything with Pops?" Thatch asked, pushing himself off the railing as Marco nodded. "I did, he said good luck and wants us to have fun," Marco said, relaying the captain's words to them. "Alright, then let's get a move on to the shops," Thatch said, pumping a fist into the air as he led the way off the ship, Marco watching him with a raised eyebrow, clearly confused but following regardless. Sabo snickered, shaking his head as he too followed, moving the wristband he wore, making sure it covered his number completely before he left the ship. He glanced over to his brothers, making sure their numbers were covered entirely as well before facing forward again, noticing Ace and Luffy were once again holding hands. Sabo had to guess that Luffy still wasn't over the nightmare. "Why don't we head that way? I know there are some cool shops over there," Thatch said, pointing off in a direction that the brothers hadn't had a chance to explore yesterday. Sounds good, Sabo said with a smile. It was only a minute later that Sabo felt Luffy grab his hand as well, walking securely between he and Ace, as they made their way through the throngs of fishermen and women. The group continued on silently until they got close to the rows of shops. At this point they all slowed down, looking through the windows in interest and looking for anything that would catch their interest. At this point, Thatch began to ramble on about different things he'd gotten the previous times they had been to the island while they walked. Luffy was looking eagerly into the stores, eyes shining at the different weapons, accessories, clothes, etc. Ace walked silently, though Sabo knew he was listening to Thatch's ramblings, due to the way he would glance over to listen to the chef every once in a while. The two eldest were trying to pay more attention to the chef, knowing that Luffy thought highly of him. For the youngest to have asked about Thatch and Aizo the minute after waking up from a nightmare, meant he thought the two were more than just good people. It meant he was beginning to trust them, find safety among them, and if that was the case, then the brothers should get used to them as well. There was this one time I bought a shirt here and the very next day, I kid you not, Blenheim tripped and spilled an entire oil can all over it. Had to get rid of it cause I couldn't get the giant stain out. Thatch said with a sigh, thinking back to the shirt with a fond look that made Ace force back a snicker. Sabo smiled, also doing his best to hold back laughter, while Marco rolled his eyes and muttered about Thatch being overdramatic. Luffy wasn't listening, or maybe he was, no one really could tell with the smile that he wore, but whether it was from Thatch's stories or the things he saw in the store no one knew. The boy was letting his eyes float from one window to the next, perfectly content with just looking for the time being. Sure, he still had his nightmare on his brain, but with his brothers next to him and funny stories coming from the chef, it was easy to ignore the uneasy feelings he got whenever he remembered the horrible dream. Ace, doesn't that look like the Tiger Lord? Luffy asked, pointing to a plush tiger in one of the windows of a toy store. Ace tilted his head, examining the toy for a minute before nodding. Yeah, it does, he said eventually, knocking Luffy's hat off and ruffling the boy's hair with a smile. Luffy beamed up to his brother, his straw hat dangling safely against his back thanks to the string. What's the Tiger Lord? Thatch asked a bit hesitantly. If it had to do with the facility then it definitely wasn't anything good, and it worried him that he may cause the brothers to have bad reactions, but they seemed to be having fond memories if their smiles were anything to go on. Still, Thatch couldn't help but worry that he brought up something he shouldn't have. It was a giant tiger that lives back on our home island. It was best to avoid it, Sabo said, looking fondly to the tiger plush as well, remembering the days before they knew about the facility, the days before they had much of anything to worry about. The giant tiger, huh? Sounds interesting, Thatch said honestly, trying to imagine said animal. Yeah, it was huge as big as these stores, Luffy said, spreading his arms out wide in an attempt to demonstrate just how big the animal was. Oh yeah, that is pretty big, Thatch said, using this new information to change his view of the tiger, wondering if Luffy was exaggerating about the size or not. It was possible that the boy had seen it and interpreted it to be much larger, seeing as he would have been a small child at the time, but you never know when it comes to things like that. Who knows, maybe there was an island with giant animals. It was. There was this one time, Ace and Sabo and we saw him, and Luffy cut himself off abruptly, eyes going wide and smile quickly shifting into a frown. They all stopped and turned to look at the boy in confusion, wondering why he had suddenly stopped talking. Ace and Sabo tightened their grip on their brother's hand, looking around for whatever was causing him to be scared, and when they saw it, their eyes widened as well. The two forced themselves to swallow down their fear, instead turning to look at Luffy, though they couldn't help but keep an eye on the man out of the corner of their eye. Come on Lou, let's go back to the Moby. Ace grumbled lowly, his happy attitude gone and replaced with a cautious, almost scared tone that confused Marco and Thatch. The two commanders looked around for the source of the brothers' fear, but they couldn't see whatever it was that they were seeing. It didn't matter though, because Ace was lifting Luffy onto his back with Sabo's help, the young boy too frozen in shock to move a muscle. Sabo kept a hand on Luffy's back, whether it was to comfort the boy or comfort himself, the commanders couldn't tell, and then Ace was turning on his heels, practically sprinting back to the ship with how fast he was walking. Marco and Thatch exchanged a look before following after them, deciding that today's outing was over. What's going on, Yuri? Marco asked Sabo, the blonde seeming to be the only one that they might be able to get an answer from. Sabo seemed to think about his answer carefully before swallowing again, turning to glance at the first commander. Doctor? We just saw Doctor's coat is all, he said curtly, not sparing them another glance as he focused on following closely along with his brothers, and the commanders didn't ask any more questions after that. They both knew that the brothers practically had a phobia of needles and doctors, so it wasn't surprising to see them having this reaction to one, but it had been so sudden and without warning that it had caught them off guard. It was unnerving to see the brothers smiling and cheerful one second and then frowning and scared the next. It only took a mere 2 minutes for them to rush back to the Moby and for the brothers to board the ship and disappear into their room. In their wake they left a bunch of confused crew members who watched them run off in confusion, all of them looking to Thatch and Marco for answers. That was unexpected. Thatch said a bit sadly, hoping the brothers would be okay. It was, Yuri. We'll have to be careful about things like this next time. We don't want them to have another reaction like this in the future. Marco said, worried for the brothers as well. He knew that people with phobias could have strong reactions when they were faced with said phobias, but it was one thing to hear about and another thing to see it. It was lucky for them that their nurses didn't wear coats like normal doctors did, or else they would have had a much harder time with the children they had saved. I'm going to tell Oyaji and the other commanders about this so that we can try preventing this from happening again, Yuri, Marco said, staring at where the boys had disappeared to for another second. Yeah, alright, that sounds good. I think I'm gonna go cook some food for them. Hopefully, they'll come out for lunch, but if not, this should keep them satiated until I can make them some food and bring it to them. Thatch said, thinking back to the last time they had what they had all dubbed as a bad day. They hadn't left their room for a second, and if they had, no one had noticed. Thatch had to bring all their meals to them, not that he minded, but they got them a bit later than everyone else, seeing as Thatch had to cook and serve everyone else before he could leave to serve the brothers. Good idea, Marco said, nodding his head as he turned and finally began walking to Whitebeard, who was watching them expectantly, knowing they would come and speak with him about whatever had happened. Thatch watched Marco walk off before shaking his head, frowning as he headed to the kitchen to begin cooking. Let's hope tomorrow will be better. Chapter 53. Heavy thoughts. After coming back from the island, the brothers stayed in their room for the rest of the day, only leaving to take bathroom breaks. The crew seemed to understand that something had happened and left them alone, Thatch making sure to bring them food, since they didn't leave for meals either. Marco had informed Whitebeard and the commanders of what had happened, and they all understood why the brothers were acting the way they were, realizing that this could possibly become a common occurrence if the brothers decided to stay. It wasn't an issue, though, it was just something they would have to be cautious of from now on. As the next day came, the brothers tossed and turned restlessly in their bed. Nightmares plagued all three of their minds, and no matter how many times they woke up and fell back asleep, they always had another. It was at 3 in the morning that Ace was the first to give up on sleeping altogether, tired of closing his eyes, only to see flashes of needles and grinning doctors hovering over him. Looking over at his brothers, he saw that they both had their faces scrunched in discomfort, obviously having more nightmares as well. Frowning at that, Ace decided to get up and walk around for a minute, hoping it would help distract him from the repeating memories in his mind. Shuffling carefully out of the bed, Ace silently tiptoed to the door, opening it without so much as a creak and slipping out into the hallway, shutting the door just as silently behind himself. As much as he wanted to wake his brothers up, stop them from experiencing their nightmares, he knew that they also needed as much sleep as they could get, regardless of whether it was filled with bad memories or not. Walking silently down the hall, Ace made sure to keep an eye on his surroundings, straining his ears as much as he could. Sometimes he took for granted Sabo's amazing hearing, the blonde able to detect anyone heading their way before he could even see them. Now that he wasn't with his brothers and he just had his normal hearing, he was a bit more jumpy, nervous that he would accidentally run into someone. Maybe he should have just stayed in the room. Despite his thoughts, Ace continued on down the hall, trying to use his better sight to compensate for his lack of hearing. It was still pitch black in the halls, but thanks to his vision he could easily maneuver his way to the door, having no problem reaching and opening it. It was slightly lighter outside, despite the fact that they were underwater where there was no moon or stars, but the light from the island illuminated the deck just enough to allow those with normal vision to see at least their hands in front of their face. But left them unable to see a few feet ahead of themselves. Ace looked up to the crow's nest, spotting the ones who were up for watch, and quickly made his way to their blind spot, not in the mood to deal with anyone who might think it was a good idea to chat. Sitting down, Ace looked up to the sky sea, watching the fish swim back and forth outside the bubble protecting them, allowing his mind to wander. He knew there were a few crew members walking the perimeter of the deck, but there was nothing Ace could do to hide from them, unless he gave up his view off the sky, and that wasn't something Ace wanted to do. Ever since leaving the facility, all three of the brothers had found that just being outside, being under the sun, the moon, the stars, even the ocean, in this case, was immensely calming to them. After nightmares, after painful memories, it was always good for them to relax outside, looking into the sky. After being forced to live underground, the freedom of being able to just sit outside showed that they were free, that they weren't back in the facility anymore, and after having unwanted memories or dreams. Just seeing the sky gave them all the confirmation they needed to tell them that they weren't there, that they were never going there again. Ace let time pass, ignoring the curious glances he got from the crew members out and about. He only let himself stay out for around half an hour, before deciding he should return to their room. It was inevitable that Sabo or Luffy would wake up soon if they hadn't already, and Ace would much rather get there soon to calm them down when they realized he wasn't there. Sabo would probably be able to hear where he was, and Luffy might smell that he wasn't too far away, But that didn't mean they wouldn't freak out, not when they were disoriented and groggy, memories of the facility fresh in their minds. It only took a minute to make his way back. He opened the door, peering in and noticing that Sabo was up now, though it didn't look like he had been up for long. Ace? The whisper clued him in even more to the fact that Sabo was extremely groggy, his voice layered with sleep. Yeah, it's me, don't worry. Ace muttered quietly, knowing Sabo would be able to hear him. Ace saw Sabo give a sigh of relief, sagging down a bit from where he was sitting up in the bed. Ace walked over to the bed now, climbing in carefully, not wanting to wake Luffy up. Where'd you go? Sabo asked, laying back down, eyes closing. Just went outside for a bit. Ace said with a shrug, closing his own eyes now as he lay back down, though he didn't see himself getting any more sleep tonight. Tonight's a bad night, Sabo said, stating the obvious with a sigh. Ace held back a scoff at that. No shit. Guess we're not going out tomorrow either. Ace said, a bit annoyed about that. He wanted to go to the island, he wanted to go eat in the galley, but because of these stupid nightmares, they would all be on edge, grouchy, and jumpy, which was not a good combination to be. Especially not when they would be around a lot of people. One wrong move and the brothers would flip out and reveal something they would rather not. It was safer for everyone if they stayed in their room for the day, better for everyone to deem this another one of their bad days, and let them be. Yeah, probably not. Sabo agreed, thinking back to the last time they'd had a bad day. That had been around when they first met the Whitebeards, when everything was still new to them. It hadn't been all that long ago, not even a whole month yet, but it felt like ages had passed since then. The room lapsed into silence after that, and Ace was sure that Sabo had fallen back asleep. Luffy woke up not too long after, but Ace managed to get him to go back to sleep for a little while longer. As the sun rose and Sabo and Luffy decided that they were going to remain awake, the brothers also decided that they would stay in their room for the day. Thanks to the nightmares, they were exactly how Ace and Sabo predicted they would be, tense, on edge, and jumpy. Time passed slowly for them as they stayed in the room. The only interesting things that happened were Ace having narcolepsy attacks, and Thatch bringing them their meals. At one point Sabo heard Shirahashi, her brothers, and Jin coming and asking where they were, but once the crew explained that today wasn't a good day they left, promising they would be back tomorrow, and that they hoped the brothers felt better. The morning slipped to noon, and then into night. Falling asleep wasn't difficult, all three of them were exhausted, bags under their eyes, so the second they lay down to sleep, they passed out immediately. Time after that passed quickly. The next day came and the brothers were met with the princess, her brothers, and Jin, just as they had promised. Shirahashi and her brothers wanted to get to know the brothers, and thank them for everything, while Jin was there to escort them and make sure they didn't get into trouble. Although they were a bit reluctant to go with a group that they didn't really know well, Luffy had convinced them to go and so they did. It had been a peaceful day, and the group went wandering around the island, though the brothers were sure to steer clear of the shops, not wanting to run into any more doctors. Shirahashi insisted they go to some place called the Sea Forest, and they agreed to go after learning that no one would be over there. It was a beautiful place, and they stayed there for the rest of the day. The brothers made quick friends with the princess and her brothers, though Jin was still a bit iffy to them. By the next day, Shirahashi and her brothers returned once again, this time without Jin, and they once again left the Mobi to go hang out together. Again, they spent the day together, and the brothers found it easy to hang out with them. They never really had friends before besides each other, but after hanging out with the mermaid and men, they were honestly able to say that they had become friends with them. Despite the fact that Shirahashi still annoyed Ace to no end with her incessant crying. Finally, it was the final day, the day they were leaving. Shirahashi and her brothers were there, along with Jinbe and King Neptune, all of them ready to see off the Whitebeard crew, as they made their way back to the surface and into the new world. The crew was bustling around the brothers who stood at the railings, talking with Shirahashi and her brothers as they waited to leave. They hadn't stayed long, but it had been long enough to get close to their new friends, and now that they were leaving it was a bit sad for them to have to say goodbye. They knew they would most likely see them again, but that didn't make it any less painful to say goodbye. Shirahashi was, not surprisingly, crying while her brothers surrounded her, talking to Sabo. Ace was doing his best to not yell at the princess, not wanting to deal with Sabo's lecturing, if he ended up doing something like that, and Luffy was smiling happily. Laughing as he talked with Shirahashi who, despite her sobs, was still chatting away with the youngest of the brothers. Ready to set sail. The shout from one of the Whitebeards signaled that they needed to wrap up their goodbyes, and only made Shirahashi cry more. Thank you three once again for all of your help. You'll always be welcome here on Fishman Island should you ever return, Jamin. Neptune said with a grateful smile. Sabo smiled to the king, bowing. It was no problem, and I'm sure we'll be back someday, Sabo said, Ace and Luffy nodding their agreement. And when you do we'll be here to take you to the palace for a visit. Fukabashi said with a smile, his brothers nodding their agreement. We sure will, Latidio Raibashi sang, doing his strange dance from where he stood slightly behind his older brother. Yes, will Manbashi sang as well, also doing his dance. Luffy laughed happily at the dances and quirks of the princes, while Sabo also thanked them as well. Finally, it was Shirahashi's turn to say goodbye, and through her sniffles and sobs, she managed to get out a soft goodbye. The brothers all easily said goodbye, minus Luffy because he didn't say goodbye to anyone. He knew he would see them again someday, and right as the ship was about to leave, Shirahashi swam up to the railing, tilting the ship a bit from her weight. "Why you'll come back and visit someday, right?" she asked, tears creating puddles on the ship's deck that left the crew freaking out, one of them calling for a mop. "Of course," Sabo said, sweat dropping as he watched the puddles grow in size. "Promise?" she asked, holding out her pinky, and once again Sabo nodded, smiling as he touched her pinky with his, Luffy mimicking easily while Ace scoffed, but did it as well. Even the princes came to join. "We promise we'll be back, don't worry," Sabo said. "Yeah, of course, we'll come back to visit someday." Luffy cheered happily. Shirahashi smiled, wiping away her tears with her free hand and nodding. "When you do I'll be stronger so that you won't have to save me again," Shirahashi promised happily. "It's a promise then." Luffy agreed, nodding his head affirmatively, feeling the resolve spread throughout the giant princess. But that said, Shirahashi let go of the railing, the Mobi once again shifting back into place, while the crew let out a sigh of relief, a group already working hard to mop up the tears. "Goodbye Luffy-san, Ace-san, Sabo-san," Shirahashi called, waving to them as the Mobi left the port. The brothers waved back, Ace doing his best to not look too grumpy, and soon, they were out of Fishman Island, and back into the murky depths of the sea. The brothers, like always, stayed at the railing until Luffy and Sabo could no longer see the island in the distance, at which point they decided to go sit near Whitebeard. The Mobi was slowly ascending to the surface, and according to some of the chattering pirates, it would take around a half hour to get back up safely. The brothers were actually a bit excited to get back to the surface, back to the real sky, not the one that they had seen for the past week on Fishman Island. The crew milled around the deck, everyone having something to do in way of chores or other work they needed to have done, like cooking or keeping watch. It was then that the trio remembered just how easily they got bored when there was nothing to do but sit around. As minutes ticked by slowly, the three did what they could to entertain themselves, Sabo listening in on conversations, Ace watching the surface get closer and closer, Luffy watching the fish swim by in amazement. At one point, Ace had a narcolepsy attack, though it was easy to hide seeing as the eldest had already been laying against the railing. The only thing Sabo and Luffy did differently was focus their attention more on their surroundings. Sure, they had come to feel much closer and safer with the crew, but they still weren't ready to let them get too close, when one of them couldn't do anything to defend themselves. No matter how trusting these pirates seemed to be, they were still unsure of them. Ace woke up soon after, eyes shooting open after having yet another nightmare. He tried to force the memory out, instead closing his eyes into barely open slits, and trying to focus back on watching those around him, but it didn't matter how hard he tried. He could still see that damn doctor standing over him, asking him how he felt after yet another injection. Scowling, Ace looked over towards Whitebeard, trying to find peace in being near the old man. Luffy seemed to be able to do it easily, although he could literally feel the peace coming from the man, but that was beside the point. It was nearly a month that they had been there, and they had said that they would give them an answer on whether or not they would join by then. So far, no one had done anything to make them not want to join. If anything, they only made them want to join more, but that also didn't sit well with Ace. He was distrusting by nature, it was just who he was, so for him to make such a big decision in just the span of a month put more pressure on him than he would have liked. He needed more than a month to know if these guys were safe to hang around. He needed, at least, 100 days to decide. Why 100? He didn't know, but it felt like a good number. Regardless, he wasn't getting that time. They were pushing it with a month, he wouldn't ask for more time than that, but that didn't mean he liked it. Even after telling them about the man he still refused to call his father, they had been nothing but accepting. Sure, it had only been Marco and Whitebeard, but that wasn't the point. No one had ever accepted him, parents and all. The second someone even pondered the idea that the late Pirate King could have a child, they sneered and demanded the child die. Demanded that he die. For someone to accept him as a person, not a monster, it was different. Sure, Sabo and Luffy accepted him, but Luffy was a strange person to begin with, and Sabo just wasn't one to judge. Ever since they had brought up the fact to the pirates, they hadn't said a word about it. They hadn't told their crew, they hadn't spoken to each other about it, and they hadn't blabbed to any marine either. Sabo had listened in to make sure of that. So were these people good? Or were they trying to get something from them? If so, what? And he couldn't forget about Teach either, the man that he wished he could kick off the crew immediately, but knew he couldn't. True to his word, Whitebeard had been keeping an eye on the bastard, even now when he wasn't even on the ship. He had believed them when they mentioned he was dangerous, and that spoke volumes to the brothers that, despite knowing his crew better than he knew them, he still listened to them, still took precautions against the man. But what was Teach after? A man with as black an aura as Luffy had described could be up to nothing good, that was for sure, but for the life of them, the brothers didn't know what it was. Breaking out of his thoughts, Ace listened as there was a loud crashing of waves around them. The Moby broke to the surface of the water and the bubble around them disappearing. Birds flew overhead, the sun shone brightly, and only a handful of clouds dotted the sky. It was peaceful, it was quiet, and it was calm. Whatever Teach was up to could wait until another day. Their decision on whether they wanted to join or not could wait as well. For now, they were going to enjoy the peace and calm while they could. Chapter 54. Pesky narcolepsy. Waking up was a slow-going process in the brothers' room. Even though breakfast was ready, even though Sabo could hear the mutterings of the crew wondering where they were at, even though the delicious smells wafted to Luffy's nose, none of them could find it in themselves to get up to go eat. Ace was still snoring away beside the two. Although he had been woken up 4 times now, each time he had just fallen right back asleep. They couldn't blame him really. Yesterday hadn't been a good day for him in terms of narcolepsy attacks. He had a few more than he usually would, and they left him exhausted. Sabo and Luffy, however, were just lazy. "We should go eat," Sabo said, but despite his words, he didn't move. Luffy hummed, also not showing any signs of moving anytime soon. They both stared at the ceiling for a minute before Sabo sighed, flinging his arm out across Luffy and hitting Ace in the chest. "Boy, Ace, get up, we have to go eat," Sabo said, and Ace woke up, startled by the sudden impact on his chest. "Why?" he asked, blinking slowly as he sat up, looking around. "Food," Sabo said simply, and although Ace looked tempted by the idea, he also looked tired. His tired eyes closed slowly and opened even slower. Sabo was pretty sure that if nothing was done, he would fall asleep sitting up. Sighing, Sabo pushed himself up, ignoring the complaints in his head, telling him to just lay back down and sleep a little while longer. There wasn't any real reason they had to be up now other than breakfast, but Sabo didn't want to worry the crew if they didn't show up. "Come on, I think Thatch is getting ready to come check on us. They think we're having another bad day," Sabo said, hearing the commanders talk amongst themselves, wondering if the brothers were going to stay locked away again today. "Let them, we can sleep then," Ace said, falling back onto the mattress. Sabo frowned, turning to glare at the oldest. "Ace, I swear to Kami, if you fall asleep right now I'm gonna tell Thatch to limit your servings," Sabo threatened. As much as Ace wanted to sleep, his love for food overpowered that, and he shot up in bed, eyes open while Luffy laughed beside him. "There, was that so hard? Now, let's go, maybe if we start moving we'll wake up more," Sabo said, standing up and turning to practically drag Luffy out of the bed, Ace helping. The rubber boy slumped to the ground with a groan, Sabo holding his now stretching arm. Letting it go, it recoiled back to the youngest with a snap, and Sabo put his hands on his hips, frowning again. "Seriously, you two are like children. Luffy, don't make me limit your servings too," Sabo said, making Luffy groan, but slowly push himself up. The blonde rolled his eyes and shook his head at the Theatrix, heading to the door. Ace and Luffy followed a bit slowly, but Sabo had been right. Once they were out of their bed, they felt more awake. Along with feeling more awake, they also felt more hungry, and soon they outpaced Sabo, making their way quickly to the galley, and practically leaving Sabo behind who huffed. "Oh, there you three are. We were beginning to think you weren't gonna show," Fasa said, smiling to the brothers who sat down at the table. Sabo smiled to them, Ace and Luffy already shoveling food into their mouths. "I had a bit of trouble getting these two out of bed was all," Sabo said, jabbing a thumb to his brothers as he picked up his fork to start eating as well. "Hey, you didn't want to move either," Ace said indignantly, to which Sabo rolled his eyes. "Yeah, but I got up without any threats necessary, unlike you two," Sabo said, not even looking to Ace who scoffed at him. "Threats?" King Du asked, all of the commanders curious as to what Sabo meant. "Nothing lethal if that's what you're thinking. I just told them I would tell Thatch to limit their servings, which was enough to get them up and moving," Sabo said with a shrug. Some of the commanders laughed at that, Whitebeard smiling from where he sat at the head of the table. "They sure do love food a lot," Vista noticed. "Always have, always will. They've always had big appetites," Sabo said, remembering their days back on their home island when they had to hunt multiple animals just to satisfy the brothers' hunger. "It's not surprising when you think about who your grandfather is. Gar can eat just as much as those two, if not more," Haruta mentioned, watching the two eating. Sabo chuckled at that, nodding. "You're right about that," he said. The commanders split into their own conversations after that, Thatch joining in soon after. Sabo listened per usual, not forcing himself into any one conversation, but preparing himself in case anyone decided they wanted him to join in. Luffy and Ace seemed wide awake now, the two of them eating with their normal gusto, and Sabo could feel that even he was awake now. Apparently, they were just having a lazy morning. It wouldn't be all that surprising, especially since they had all been a bit on edge ever since seeing the doctor's coat on Fishman Island. Breakfast began to finish up, and the brothers left to go sit near Whitebeard. Suddenly Sabo's mind wandered to the fact that it had nearly been an entire month of being with the Whitebeards, being free of the facility that had tormented them for years on end. Ace had mentioned it yesterday, but they hadn't really discussed it much. In just 2 days they would have to give Whitebeard their decision on whether or not they wanted to officially join the crew or not. Sabo let himself get lost in thought on the matter, trying to weigh the pros and cons, trying to find reasons they shouldn't possibly stay, trying to find reasons they absolutely should stay. Of course, they would all talk about this in more detail tomorrow with each other, and even the day after, because none of them wanted to agree to stay if they were just going to regret it immediately. Sitting on the railing, their usual pastime, was becoming more and more boring for the three. Even though Sabo was distracted with his thoughts, Ace and Luffy still weren't doing much. Luffy was trying his best to let the clouds and ocean entertain him, but his limbs ached to be stretched, to extend as far as possible. The few times he'd had the chance to had been glorious, but now he was back to forcing himself to remain normal, to give no indication that he had a devil fruit. Even though no one on the crew had even an inkling that the brothers possessed devil fruits, they had to stay cautious. Sabo had said so. Even though they had seen Luffy treading water all that time ago, they still had to be careful with what they showed. Luffy knew that Ace was having the same problem as him, the eldest fire just itching to rise to the surface, but he controlled himself too. If Ace could do it, Luffy could too. That doesn't mean he was happy about it though. Luffy pouted as he stared at his feet which were swinging freely in the air. If they joined, would he be able to stretch? Surely he would, because then that would mean they trusted the crew enough to know about their powers. However, Luffy didn't want to join just so he could use his powers freely. Sure, it would be a plus, but Luffy didn't want to join solely because of that. He wanted to join when he knew that he could trust the crew to keep him and his brothers safe, without doing anything to hurt them. They'd kept so much from the pirates, kept so many secrets from them, that Luffy didn't even know that, even if they joined, and they told them everything, how they would react. Would they suddenly change their minds once they knew about their powers? Once they knew about what the facility did to them? He knew Whitebeard wouldn't, Marco either, and maybe not Thatch and Izo, but everyone else was still up in the air to him. It was impossible for Luffy to get a good read on everyone on the ship without having to get close to them, and they hadn't been there long enough for that to be possible. With more time, Luffy would definitely be able to determine that, but for now, he only had a general feeling that most people on the Moby were good people. Luffy sighed quietly, ignoring the feeling of sudden worry coming from Ace. Why don't we go talk to Thatch? Sabo suddenly tapped, shocking Luffy as he looked over to the blonde who was smiling to him. He said we might be able to trust him, right? Like Marco and Whitebeard. Sabo asked, Luffy nodding minutely in response. Then let's go make sure. Sabo said. Luffy beamed happily, ready to do anything as long as it was entertaining, and he spun around, planting his feet on the deck and standing. They stretched, once again putting on the act of having just woken up, and stood as well, ruffling Luffy's hair as he did so. Sabo stood as well and took a second to listen for the chef, finding that he wasn't too far away. He was out on the deck, a bit closer to the galley. He was doing something. Sabo couldn't quite figure it out with sound alone, but it sounded a bit like he was scrapping something. Shrugging it off, Sabo began leading his brothers his way, and soon he was able to see the man sitting against the railing, sharpening his knives. Well, that made more sense. Sabo smiled in greeting as they got closer, and Thatch beamed happily back. He always seemed interested in the brothers, and not in a bad way. He always seemed like he genuinely wanted to get to know them better, and according to Luffy, he was always more than happy whenever they went up to talk to him. Now, didn't seem to be any different as the brothers sat beside the chef, Ace doing his best to keep the scowl off his face, as he saw the many eyes on them. It wasn't often that they did anything other than sitting on the railing, so it was no surprise that they had garnered the attention of most of the crew, by coming to sit with Thatch. Hello, Thatch. Sabo greeted, still smiling to the chef. Hey. What's up? Thatch asked, curious as to why the brothers were suddenly sitting and chatting with him. It wasn't often they went and initiated conversations with anyone, and when they did it was with Marco or Pops. Not much, it was just getting a bit boring sitting on the railing, you know. Sabo asked, turning to look at the deck, the crew avoiding his gaze, and pretending to be suddenly busy. The blonde held back a laugh at that. Oh, yeah, I guess that would get pretty boring, huh? Thatch asked, also turning to look at the deck. The chef wasn't quite sure if he should continue the conversation or wait and let Sabo do it himself. Normally the brothers didn't like to be bothered, and when they initiated conversations they normally had something they wanted to talk about, but as the silence stretched on, Thatch realized that maybe he should speak. Or maybe they wanted silence. I like your hair. It's poofy. Luffy suddenly piped up, shocking Thatch from his thoughts. His feelings of turmoil quickly slipped away as another smile graced his face, turning to look at the youngest of the brothers excitedly. Thanks, you know, I used this special gel to make it this poofy. He said proudly, touching the extended hair gently with a hand. Really, can you make my hair poofy like that too? Luffy asked excitedly, practically bouncing where he sat. Thatch chuckled at that, noticing that the older two brothers were watching him with looks that didn't give away their emotions. Sure, Sabo had a bit of a smile on, but his eyes told him that he was feeling more than he was showing. What he was feeling, though, he had no idea. I don't think you have enough hair, but maybe if you grow it out it would work, Thatch said, looking at Luffy's short hair. He remembered when they had first taken the brothers in, how all of their hair had been long and unkempt. He had nearly forgotten about that, though it hadn't been all that long ago. The conversation continued between Luffy and Thatch over the course of an hour. Sometimes Sabo would join in, and rarely Ace would make a comment as well, but for the most part, the older two remained quiet, watching. After the hour ended though, Thatch had to, regretfully, bid the brothers goodbye. Sorry, but I have to go start lunch now. It was nice talking to you three, the chef said, standing. The brothers stood up as well, Sabo's small smile growing in size as he said his goodbyes. It's no problem, Thatch, thank you for talking with us, Sabo said, Luffy nodding and waving happily. I like talking with you, Thatch. Bye. The youngest called. Thatch smiled and waved back, turning to walk to the kitchen. So back to the railing, Ace asked, looking around the deck. Marco and some of the other commanders were standing near Whitebeard's chair, only Namor, Rikuo and Jiro missing from the group. And Thatch as well, obviously. That's so. Lunch should be soon, so that's a good thing. Sabo replied with a bit of a shrug, already beginning to walk away. Luffy and Ace walked next to him, Luffy in between them like normal, and they made their way over quietly. They were almost there when it happened. They were just nearing Whitebeard when Ace felt the sudden tug of exhaustion fog his mind. Luffy could feel Ace's feelings become muted like they normally did whenever someone went to sleep, and Sabo could hear Ace's normal breathing become much slower and deeper. In a matter of seconds, Ace went from walking and awake to falling and asleep. Sabo and Luffy both moved into action, the youngest grabbing Ace's arm, in an attempt to slow his fall, while Sabo rushed around Luffy, grabbing the fire user's head to prevent any injury to it in his fall. The sudden noise around them clued them into the fact that everyone was beginning to freak out, having just seen Ace suddenly collapse in front of them. Sabo cursed silently as he heard the commanders rushing over and saw Luffy looking at him with wide, scared eyes. They hadn't told anyone about Ace's narcolepsy, and now they were going to have to face the consequences of that decision. Sabo heard Izo tell someone to call Whiskey, and his worry began to increase. Luffy and Sabo both knew that Ace was fine, they both knew that this was just a normal narcolepsy attack, but the rest of the crew didn't know that, and by the looks on their faces, they were worried that this could be a lot more serious than it was. Sabo could even see Whitebeard watching them carefully, a look of worry in his eyes, as he gripped the arms of his chair a bit too tightly. Normally whenever Ace had attacks he had a bit of warning, but apparently, this one had happened so suddenly he hadn't had a chance to warn them of it. What happened, Yuri? Marco asked as he came to kneel beside Ace with the brothers. The commanders stood behind him, but not too close, giving them space. Sabo didn't know how to respond, because he knew what had happened, but should he tell them? Surely he should, to stop all of this chaos, to make them realize this wasn't that big a deal, but he was stopped from answering when Whiskey ran up to them, dropping to her knees as she looked to him and Luffy. What happened here? She asked, unknowingly repeating Marco's question. Luffy looked to Sabo, not knowing what to say, not knowing what his brothers would want him to say. He could feel the anxiety and fear in Sabo, and he could feel the muted fear from Ace. The eldest was probably having another nightmare, and that wasn't going to be good when he woke up. We were walking and he suddenly fell, Sabo said after a minute of internal debate over what he should say. He knew he should just tell them what happened, tell them that Ace had narcolepsy, but the fear of everyone suddenly knowing his brother's disease kept him from saying it. The fear of what Whiskey might do if she knew that they had kept the condition from her, even after she had asked them in the beginning if they had any medical issues. Normally Sabo was the logical one, but in this situation, all of his logic was thrown out the window. His breathing sounds okay, his heart too, Marco, carry him to the infirmary for me. I'll need to check him out there. Whiskey was cut off when Ace suddenly let out a gasp, shooting upwards with eyes open wide in panic. Sabo vaguely heard Luffy tap to him that their brother had had a nightmare as Whiskey, and Marco backed up a little to avoid getting headbutted by the now awake Ace. The Raven looked around in confusion for a minute before seeming to figure out what had happened. Sabo and Luffy both had a look of fear that made Ace suddenly realize that there was a nurse at his side, as well as the first commander. Not to mention, the hundreds of eyes on them. Are you alright? Does anything hurt? Head, eyes, chest? Whiskey suddenly asked. Fighting the sneer, fighting the urge to yell that he was just fine, Ace swallowed, his lips twitching a bit downward. No, nothing hurts, I'm fine. Ace said, his speech just a bit slurred, and he cursed himself for that. He was trying to get the nurse off his back, not justify her claims that he was not okay. I'd like to do a checkup if you don't mind, just to make sure you're okay, she said, and the brothers could sense that it wasn't really a suggestion like she made it sound. It was more of a demand, and that only put them all even more on edge. Can you walk? She continued, not letting the brothers think for even a second. Ace, still not knowing what he should do, only nodded and began pushing himself off the ground, his brothers standing with him. Marco and Whiskey stood as well, and the group began making their way to the infirmary, Marco heading towards Whitebeard instead. The brothers were actually a bit dismayed to see him walk away. Even though they didn't want anyone knowing about Ace's narcolepsy, they also didn't want to be left alone with a bunch of nurses. Marco was someone they knew they could trust, someone they knew was safe, and his presence in the infirmary would definitely have helped. It was too late to change anything now though, as they all made their way into the hallways leading to the infirmary. Sabo could hear the immediate uproar on deck as people began discussing what had happened, all of them trying to figure out what happened in the first place. The blonde sighed and could see Luffy fumbling with the hem of his shirt nervously, no doubt the smell of medicine and rubbing alcohol already reaching his nose. Ace was clenching and unclenching his hands nervously, and Sabo was no better off than his brothers, hands twitching at his side. The walk was made silently and within seconds they were entering the infirmary they had come to know little too well. Whiskey gestured to a bed in the front, telling them to wait for her there as she went to a cabinet and pulled a paper out, attaching it to her clipboard as she grabbed a few tools for the checkup. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy watched her movements carefully, not daring to look away for even a second, while also being aware that there was also a multitude of other nurses in the room with them. Whiskey returned quickly, scribbling something down before looking at Ace with a smile. I know you guys don't like it here, so I'll try to be quick. Just explain to me what happened while I take a look at your reflexes, as well as make sure everything else is fine as well. Whiskey said, clicking a tiny flashlight on that she began shining in Ace's eyes, moving it back and forth, while instructing him to follow it. Well, we were just walking back to the railing after talking to Thatch, and then Ace fell unconscious, Sabo said reluctantly. There was no use trying to hide the information or lie, after all, everyone on deck had seen the whole thing. Has this happened before? She asked. There was more silence as the brothers mulled over their options. They could just not answer, but that would be answer enough. They could answer truthfully, but that would just lead to more questions, as well as the inevitable conclusion that Ace had narcolepsy. They could lie about it, but then Whiskey would probably keep them here to make sure things were fine, and still might even find out about the narcolepsy regardless. So what choice did they really have? Even if they told the truth, told her about the narcolepsy, that would just end in her being mad at them for not telling her in the first place. Ace, what do you want me to say? Sabo asked the eldest, knowing that, ultimately, it was his decision. Ace's lips thinned, Whiskey still waiting for an answer, and thought. He had already come to the same conclusions that Sabo had, and it was just a matter of choosing which evil he wanted to face. Of course, Ace had to take into account that in just a couple of days they would also be making a decision on whether they wanted to join the crew or not, and if they did join, they would have to tell them about his condition anyways. Maybe it would just be better to get it off their chests now rather than later when it would be an even bigger issue. Just tell her. Ace finally decided, much to his brother's surprise. He wasn't happy about this, not one bit, but it would have happened eventually. After telling Whitebeard and Marco about his father, this should be a walk in the park, but this felt different. When they told the captain and first mate about his father, it had been their choice. They had decided amongst themselves, in their own time, to tell people that they trusted. Now, however, they were practically being forced to give up information they weren't yet ready to share, and to someone that they trusted the least on this entire ship, of course, not including Teach. Sabo, still in a bit of shock, turned to look at the nurse, preparing himself for whatever was going to happen, now that they revealed the information they'd held for so long. Has happened before, Sabo said a bit nervously, though trying his best to keep from showing just how nervous this whole thing made him. Whiskey seemed to notice the nervousness and raised an eyebrow, writing more information down. Do you know how many times? She asked, and Sabo was tempted to just tell her outright that it was narcolepsy that caused this to stop any further questioning, but he couldn't find it in himself to say it just yet, instead opting to answer the question. No, it's happened a lot, he said, waiting for the anger that he was sure was going to come. Luffy was watching the nurse intently, watching her aura for any sudden hints of grey or even black, while also keeping a read on her emotions for any anger or malice towards his brothers. A lot. As in a couple. A handful. A dozen. She asked, needing more specific information than that. More like a couple hundred, Sabo mumbled, but was loud and clear enough for the nurse to understand. It was true though, that Ace had had hundreds of attacks. They didn't always used to be as frequent when they were children, but after everything that had happened in the facility his attacks had become much more frequent. Whiskey had gone silent at that, and the brothers watched as her lips thinned a bit. Luffy could feel a hint of anger beginning to take form in the nurse, causing him to shift nervously away from her, and closer to Sabo. The two of them were sitting on the bed with Ace, but Luffy had positioned himself the furthest away from the nurse in fear that something like this would start to happen. Alright, when did it start? She asked, not even looking up at them anymore, only focusing on her clipboard. She's getting a little angry. Luffy tapped quietly, his eyes slightly larger, rounder, in fear. Sabo wrapped an arm around Luffy, squeezing his brother's shoulder comfortingly. They had all expected this, knew this was going to happen, so this wasn't surprising, just nerve-wracking. Ever since I was a kid. Ace grumbled, having also taken notice to Luffy's sudden rise in fear and unease. Before or after the facility? she asked, the brothers flinching at the mention of that place. Before, he answered quickly, anger laced in his tone at the memories that were brought up. Did you ever get examined for this before? She continued, crossing something out on the paper. Ace didn't really know how to answer that. He hadn't been allowed to go to the village, and there was no way in hell doctors in that stupid noble town were gonna take a look at him, but the bandits had checked on him after his first few attacks. They had been the ones to figure out that he had narcolepsy, but they weren't exactly doctors. Not exactly. Didn't visit a lot of doctors, but our caretakers took care of it, Ace said, not sure how to phrase it. Of course, by taking care of it, Ace meant that they told him what it was and left him to deal with it, but that was how they dealt with everything. Does that mean you know what this is? Whiskey asks, finally lowering the clipboard as she looked at the brothers, finally noticing the looks of hesitation and fear on their faces. The fear, however, was easier to see on Luffy than it was on Ace or Sabo, who did a much better job of hiding it. That didn't mean she didn't notice it though. She sighed, realizing that she might have just screwed up a bit. They all knew of the brothers' deathly fear of doctors, they knew they were hiding things from them, knew that they were cautious about any information that they gave out, and yet she had gone and pressured it out of them. She had gotten mad, not at them exactly, but she had still gotten mad and put them in a state of fear that she hadn't intended on doing. Look, I'm sorry, I'm not mad at you three really, I'm just upset that you kept something like this from us. The reason I asked in the beginning if you had pre-existing medical conditions was to make sure I didn't make them any worse when giving you three any medical care that you might need. I'm just upset that I could have possibly harmed you further because I didn't know about this from the beginning, she said, tone apologetic as she spoke. I'm sorry if I scared you or pressured information out of you, it wasn't my intention. She finished, leaving the brothers a bit calmer, but a lot more surprised. Luffy quickly confirmed that she was telling the truth, leaving the three back to square one with what they knew about the nurses. Back at the facility, doctors took and forced information out of them with no remorse. They got results they wanted no matter the consequences, and here they were, sitting in front of a nurse who was apologizing for doing what they had come to know as normal, expected even. Sure, the facility was full of sick, twisted people, and sure, they knew that they shouldn't believe that every doctor or nurse would act the same way that the ones in the facility had, but it was difficult to suddenly change the mindset that all doctors were evil. After all, if you were told that apples were red your entire life, saw with your own two eyes that it was true, and then suddenly be told that, no, apples are actually purple, would you be all that willing to believe it? It's alright, it's partially our fault for not mentioning it in the first place, Sabo said hesitantly. This was new territory for all of them. They knew that Whiskey wasn't that bad a person, that she wasn't like the other doctors, but every time they met with her, all previous interactions were wiped from their minds, and all they saw was the big bad evil doctor that was out to get them. Maybe they should try working on fixing that. That may be the case, and it is, but I still should have taken into account your previous experiences with doctors and nurses alike. Again, I'm truly sorry. Whiskey repeated, sounding sincere as she apologized to the brothers. They sat in stunned silence for a minute before Ace suddenly spoke up. Narcolepsy, he said, confusing the nurse. I have narcolepsy, he elaborated, Whiskey's face lighting up in realization. She quickly wrote something down, a hint of a smile on her face as she did, and nodded. Were you taking any medication to help it? She asked, the eldest shaking his head. No, I always just dealt with it, he said, the trio slowly getting over their shock as the conversation progressed. Did it get better or worse after your time in the facility? Whiskey questioned, face back down into clipboard. Worse, he had attacks a lot more often. Sometimes multiple times a day. He used to only have them once in a while. Sabo said, knowing that Ace's memory about his attacks was always a little fuzzy, especially when the doctors would knock him out with drugs, and he couldn't tell what was an attack and what was the result of a drug. And are they any better since you've been out? Whiskey continued. Yeah, I only ever have them once in a day like before, but they still happen more often than they used to. Sometimes days in a row. Ace answered. A few more questions were asked, like if he had dreams when he had attacks, if he hallucinated before or after them, if he ever woke up paralyzed, and after they answered everything Whiskey sighed, placing her pencil down and looking at the brothers. Well, that should be everything. Is there anything else I should know? She asked, eyeing them all with a raised eyebrow, though she was smiling a bit to ease the tension. Sabo remembered Ace's fast healing, but that wasn't something they were ready to mention just yet. Along with the fact that two of them had devil fruit abilities. No, that was the only thing for now. However, there are a few more things, but you won't know those unless we join the crew, Sabo said, wanting to prevent any more anger from the nurse in the future. It was true though, because the only way they would tell her about those was if they were part of the crew, which was still something they were deciding on. Whiskey didn't look pleased to hear this, and Sabo gave her a sheepish look. I promise it's nothing you could harm with medication, at least, I don't think so. Besides, we'll be making the decision within a few days. Sabo explained, ready for this to be over. They had been in there for nearly half an hour now, and Luffy's nose was definitely starting to become too bothersome for him. The youngest kept discreetly trying to rub and mess with his nose, even going as far as to bury his face in Sabo's sleeve to try and block the scent from burning the sensitive appendage. "I'll let it go this once, but you have to promise to tell me, alright?" she asked, seeming genuinely concerned about their health. Sabo nodded at that, promising despite their fear of doctors and nurses, and Whiskey sighed. "In that case, you good to go then. If you want, we could look into getting you medication that would help reduce how often you have attacks, although it's not a guarantee that it will help," Whiskey said to Ace. Ace thought about it for a second before shaking his head. "I've been just fine without it, thanks for the offer though," he said, and Sabo was proud that his brother hadn't been rude throughout this entire ordeal. Whiskey smiled at them, nodding. "It was no problem. Thank you for telling me about this. One more thing before you go though. Seeing as you three aren't yet a part of the crew officially, I have no obligation to tell Aoji about this. However, should you three decide to officially join, I would have to tell him about this for safety reasons. None of the commanders would know, not unless it's a matter of emergency, but I just thought you should know," she said, standing and heading back to the filing cabinet she got in the paper form, filing it away carefully. "We understand. Thank you for explaining," Sabo said gratefully. She nodded, telling them they were free to go, and the brothers practically bolted for the doors. Hopefully, it would be a very, very long time until they needed to be in there again. Chapter 55. Thinking things through. It was the day before their big decision. Tomorrow, the brothers would have to decide whether or not they wanted to officially join the Whitebeard Pirates or not. It was a decision that held a lot of significance for the three, not just because they would be bound to the crew, bound to the captain, but because they would be obligated to give information that they didn't know if they were ready to share or not. They could always lie, make an elaborate story about how, sure the facility was bad, but they hadn't done anything life-altering to the boys. Sure, they'd been there for 7 years of their life, but they weren't given any weird powers or anything. They weren't tested on, they weren't forced to watch children die day after day, they weren't forced to eat disgusting soup, because it was their only source of nutrition. Sure, they could say none of that had happened, they could continue hiding their powers, continue hiding the fact that they spent day after passing day plotting a way to escape, but that would be too dangerous. What if they found out about the lie? What if the Marines finally sent out news about what had happened in the facility? Seeing as it was a government-run facility, there was zero chance of that happening, but there was always a possibility that someone with too much information got to the press before they could stop it. So making this decision was an extremely difficult decision. The brothers sat on the railing, breakfast having long passed and lunch coming up faster than they could keep up with. Time ticked away in hours that felt like minutes, all of them lost in thought. Normally they would be keeping a high alert for anyone getting too close, would use all their senses together to keep a safe bubble around themselves, but today they were all too deep in thought to even attempt that. It was a good thing Teach wasn't there because this would be the perfect time to attack. They sat close to Whitebeard, maybe even closer than normal, finding comfort in the man they knew could be trusted. Marco stood close by as well, keeping an eye on the brothers, and they didn't mind. After yesterday's incident with Ace, Marco had been watching them carefully, practically waiting to see Ace go tumbling again. Luffy confirmed that the man was only worried, not waiting for a chance to attack like Ace had begun suspecting, and they let him watch, knowing that they weren't paying enough attention to watch themselves at the moment. Sabo had heard Whiskey from the safety of their room last night, briefly explained to the captain and commanders that Ace was alright, that nothing life-threatening was at play, and it had calmed them down from the panic they had been in. Of course, as promised, she didn't mention anything about the fact that he had narcolepsy, instead saying that it was doctor-patient confidentiality information that they weren't allowed to know unless Ace himself told them. That, after finding out about what happened, had become a bit of a worrywart, making the brothers snacks in between lunch, and even bringing them dessert as well after dinner, which was unexpected. Of course, they didn't complain and took the food gratefully, but Sabo made sure to thank the chef and tell him it wasn't necessary to go out of his way to make them the snacks. Sabo sighed as he watched the waves crash against the Moby. He knew this would be good for them, just like agreeing to stay with the Whitebeards indefinitely was good for them. But that didn't mean it was any less scary to think about giving up that tiny piece of freedom they had worked so hard to get. Sure, they would still be free to go to islands, free to sleep in a bed, free to eat meals, but they would have to answer to Whitebeard, give up the freedom of doing as they please without worry. Now, they wouldn't just be going around as themselves, they would be going around as official members of the Whitebeard Pirates. They would always have the strength of Whitebeard behind them, but they would have to take on the obligations of a crew member. They'd always dreamed of being pirates, but whenever they imagined it, this scenario had never crossed their minds. It had always been thought that they would be pirate captains, captains of their very own crew, and here they were, contemplating whether they were going to follow under a captain they had only come to know over the course of a month. Luffy was having many of the same thoughts because he had made a promise to Shanks to build a crew up that would one day beat his in his journey to become the Pirate King. He still fully intended on doing just that. His dream was to become Pirate King, no matter what, but if he joined this crew, would he still be able to keep that promise? Was his decision already made for him? No matter how much he liked the old captain, how much he liked the first commander, even how much he was beginning to like Thatch and Izo and some of the others, he wouldn't join because of that if it meant giving up his lifelong dream. But what if he could accomplish both? Would he join if that was an option? If he could become his own captain later and become the Pirate King like promised, would he join the crew? The question swam around Luffy's head, becoming muddled. Of course, he had to take into account the fact that this would mean being on the same crew as Teach, someone he knew for a fact was no good, but if he joined he would be able to protect those he was beginning to trust better. Vaguely, Luffy could smell food wafting over to him. Lunch was nearly done, but he couldn't find it in himself to care. Ace watched the crew chatting, laughing, cleaning. He could see that they, at least on the surface, cared about each other. It was a big crew, it was inevitable you'd find at least one person you liked here, but on the flip side, that just meant you'd also find people you disliked. Despite this, no one looked like they hated each other. They all greeted each other with the same smile, they all used kind words, they all helped others out with chores. It was weird to Ace, a normally hot-headed and hard to get along with person, to ponder the idea that here, everyone got along. Surely there were fights every once in a while, that was inevitable with a crew this size, but for no one to have any obvious disdain for another crew member baffled him. Had he become a captain like he had planned so long ago, he wouldn't tolerate his crew not getting along with one another, and he supposed it would be the same here, so why did it confuse him so much? Was he just looking for reasons to not want to stay? The idea of staying indefinitely had been hard for him to agree with, but he had eventually agreed after admitting that it would be better if they did. But did that mean they had to join to get the full benefits of being with the Whitebeard pirates? Did they have to anchor themselves to this crew permanently? What happens when they get betrayed? When the crew turns on them? They would be unable to leave because they had agreed to join. Making this decision was going to be the hardest for Ace because he knew everything was at risk here. This was the make or break point, the point of no return, because if they agreed, then they would finally find out whether the pirates were acting or not, whether this was an elaborate plan to get them to join, just so they would be tethered here, unable to leave. The shitty Gramps had mentioned briefly that these were good people, and that was a lot seeing as he hated pirates, or at least seemed to anyway, but the facility had been a government-run building, so who's to say that Garp hadn't set them up? Great, now he was beginning to distrust even his own grandfather. Even though the man was hard to get along with, rarely came to visit, and had questionable teaching methods, he was still family. This decision was too much for Ace to be thinking about right now. Looking down at his hands, Ace began picking at his nails, a frown on his face. Even as he tried to think of something else, anything else, all he could think of was what could happen tomorrow. Giving a frustrated sigh, Ace dropped his hands at his sides, looking at his outstretched legs. Why did this have to be so complicated? Why did the Marines have to a bunch of no-good dirty bastards? He and his brothers hadn't done a single criminal act in their life, he wasn't counting all the dine and dashes, and pickpocketing back home, seeing as it was either do that and survive, or don't and die, and yet they were all already condemned to death despite this. Sure, they had planned on being pirates, but that wasn't a crime, not yet anyway. All three brothers were so lost in thought that they didn't even notice that lunch was now ready, and the deck was slowly becoming more and more empty, as the crew filtered into the galley. They probably never would have noticed had Marco not walked towards them. Seeing the commander's sandaled feet growing closer, Ace remembered he was supposed to be sleeping, so he forcibly relaxed his posture and deepened his breathing, hoping the first commander hadn't noticed the fact that he had been awake, although, knowing his luck, he had. After all, the man had been watching them closely for the past few hours now. "Hello, Commander," Sabo said, reverting back to the title rather than the man's name. He had noticed Ace's sudden change, and realized that someone was probably getting close, snapping him from his thoughts. Luffy, almost disorientedly, turned to look at the man as he stopped a few feet away from them. "Lunch is ready, I was wondering if you three were coming," he said, an eyebrow raised slightly higher than the other. Sabo turned as well now, giving Marco a small smile. "We are, thank you," he said a bit shortly. Sabo knew that the man was only concerned for them, worried they were going to think themselves to death out here, and they probably would, but with tomorrow looming over their heads, food felt like an inconvenience. However, Sabo knew it was something they needed, so regrettably, he stood, Luffy following suit and Ace stretching. Marco nodded at them, giving them one more look that didn't show what he was feeling, before turning to head to the galley. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy were left out on the deck, only a few who were on watch remaining outside with them. "Thinking sucks," Ace grumbled, rubbing his forehead. Already, half their day had been dedicated to just thinking, and Ace didn't know if he liked that thought or not. "Thinking's important, but I think ours is getting a bit out of hand," Sabo said with a sigh, also massaging his temple. Luffy remained silent from where he stood in between the brothers, but even he looked tired for someone who had only woken up not all that long ago. "Have you two come to any conclusion?" Sabo asked as they began a slow walk toward the galley. They all knew they had been thinking about the same thing, it wasn't that hard to figure out. And maybe if they talked out loud about it, they would be able to organize their thoughts better and come to a conclusion faster than if they tried solving the issue on their own. None here. Ace muttered almost bitterly. Me neither, Luffy said softly as well. Sabo sighed, not really having expected them to. Yeah, I didn't either. Sabo reluctantly agreed, pushing open the door and ending their conversation, as the sounds of laughter and conversation filtered to their ears. The smell of food lingered in the air, and the joyful, happy spirit was a harsh contrast to the brothers' gloomy, heavy mood. They went to the usual table, this time sitting beside Vista, and were quickly greeted with their own plate of food that they began picking at. Of course, the commanders and captain easily picked up on something being wrong with the brothers, because any other time they would start chowing down, but all day the brothers had been quieter and more subdued than normal. Sure, they weren't talkative by any means, and they normally sat on the railing for most of the day, but today had been different. Any other time, Sabo and Luffy would be happily pointing out clouds or watching the waves peacefully, while Ace slept calmly behind them. Today, however, Sabo and Luffy were fidgety, and not a single smile graced their faces as they solemnly watched the waves. It hadn't passed any of their attention either that Ace was fidgety like he couldn't get comfortable the entire time he sat there with his brothers. There had been a solemn air around the three that deterred anyone from trying to get too close. And now they weren't all that interested in eating. Normally they would chalk it up to a bad day, but when the brothers had a bad day they normally shut themselves off in their room. The fact that they were here in the galley meant that either they were on the verge of a bad day, or this was something else entirely, and they had no idea which it was. Lunch dragged on slowly, and although they didn't feel all that hungry, the brothers still ate everything they were given. Ace and Luffy didn't eat the normal amount of servings they usually would, but the fact that they'd eaten anything at all had pleased Sabo enough that he didn't push it. They would be back to eating their normal amount soon enough anyway. As they left the galley, the three quickly discussed whether they should just go to their room for the rest of the day, and seeing as they had important things they needed to discuss, they decided it was better if they were in the privacy of their room to do it, so with that, they headed to their room. How far have you gotten in your decision? Sabo asked as he sat on the bed. I've got nothing so far. Ace huffed as he joined him. I still want to be Pirate King, Luffy mumbled as he crawled in between his brothers. They sat in silence for a minute after that before the conversation really began. Why don't we just state the pros and cons? Like last time, what are the benefits of joining, what are the benefits of not? Sabo asked, deciding they had to start discussing this sooner rather than later. We'll start with pros, like we would have the full power of Whitebeard on our side, Sabo said, the others understanding what was being asked. We could really warn them about Teach. Luffy piped up because it was kind of silently agreed upon that, should they decide to join, they would tell the pirates everything about what had happened to them, including their powers. Don't have to worry about getting kicked off. Ace muttered, arms crossed behind his head. If they joined, then they wouldn't have to worry about being kicked to the curb if the pirates felt they overstayed their welcome. Of course, even if they joined they could still be kicked off the crew, but if it turned out that the pirates weren't acting, then there wasn't a chance that would happen. We could actually try and get closer to these people, Sabo added, thinking of the many people they didn't even say hi to yet. And so the list went on, the brothers voicing everything they'd been thinking in terms of why it was a good idea to stay. It was a pretty sizable list, and it made the brothers feel a bit better to organize the thoughts that had been weighing them down all day. I think that's everything for pros, but what about cons? Sabo asked, sitting up in the bed now. Luffy and Ace frowned as they remembered some of the reasons they didn't want to join. I still want to have my own crew and be Pirate King, but if we join, would we be able to leave too? Luffy asked softly, taking his hat off his head and twirling it in his hands. Then they could just be acting. If we agree to join, that would be the time that they reveal that they really are a bunch of dirty bastards. Ace mentioned with a scowl. We would also answer to Whitebeard instead of being able to do whatever we wanted, Sabo said with a sigh. Like the pros, the feeling the brothers got from voicing their concerns was relieving, almost therapeutic. The cons continued, but they found that they had significantly less reason to join than they did vice versa. Most of the cons themselves had been their paranoid thoughts and fears, but Luffy's first con had brought up a good point. If they had the freedom to join, would they lose the freedom to leave? Freedom was an important thing for the brothers. After working 7 years to gain back their stolen freedom, there was a chance that they were about to hand it back over, to a pirate captain no less. If they were to agree to join, would they lose that bit of freedom they'd worked so hard to get back? I want to join, but I want to be able to leave, so I can keep my promise to Shanks. Luffy said, the hat now resting motionlessly in his lap. And really, that was all it came down to. If they agreed to join, and they still had the freedom to leave whenever they wanted, then the brothers couldn't find any real objection to saying no. After all, there was no way they were going to find out if they were amazing actors until they agreed or disagreed. There was no way of knowing if Whitebeard would kick them to the curb if they didn't agree. There was no way of knowing if Teach was the master planner behind this whole thing unless they agreed and found out themselves. I would join too, as long as the option to leave remained. Sabo agreed. The two turned to Ace, wondering how he felt about this. After all, if one of them didn't agree to join, then none of them would. Ace seemed to realize this as well as he sighed again, running his finger through his hair as he thought. If we can leave, I think I would join too. Ace muttered a bit reluctantly. Sabo and Luffy smiled, and the blonde nodded. It's decided then. If we have the freedom to leave, then we'll join. Chapter 56. To join or not to join. Today was the day. The day that they would tell Whitebeard their decision on whether or not they wanted to join the Whitebeard Pirates officially or not. Even though they had come to a decision yesterday, they had still spent the rest of the day wondering just what could happen after agreeing or disagreeing. Thoughts of the pirates turning on them, thoughts of having to call Shanks, or even Gramps, thoughts of the pirates accepting them, only to turn on them when they least expected it. All of it filled their heads as they tried getting through the day. And now they were going to see just which one of the outcomes that they'd created would come true. Breakfast was a quiet event that seemed to drag on for the brothers because they knew that the second it ended, they were going to ask to speak to Whitebeard and Marco, to tell them that they would join, should they have the freedom to leave if they wanted. So when they finally finished breakfast and they saw everyone was finishing as well, Sabo spoke up, asking if they could speak with the captain and first mate. They, of course, agreed, and they all began heading back to the same meeting room that they had always gone to. The walk was quick, silent, and nerve-wracking for the brothers. When they finally were in and sat down, Marco and Whitebeard looked at that, waiting for them to speak. Sabo took a deep breath, steeling his nerves for whatever could possibly be the outcome of this conversation. Same plan as last time, Luffy. If they turn on us, grab the snail phone, and then we'll run to the lifeboats and call Shanks. Sabo explained before he said anything. Luffy gave a small nod in understanding, Ace practically on the edge of his seat in anticipation. Looking up at Whitebeard, Sabo got ready to speak. It's been a month since you helped us escape from the facility, so we thought we would finally give you an answer on whether we wanted to join your crew officially or not. Sabo started, and Whitebeard and Marco seemed to have expected this, both nodding and remaining silent. We just have one question before we agree, or deny, the offer. Sabo continued, to which Whitebeard nodded. Ask away. He set a small smile on his face. Normally whenever someone smiled at the brothers in a tense situation such as this, it had bad intentions behind it, but this one was peaceful, even calming. There was no hidden motive, there was no malice, no ill will towards the brothers, just a warm, gentle smile. We were wondering if, should we decide to join officially, would we still have the freedom to leave the crew if we wanted to? Sabo asked, wondering just what the captain's answer would be. The brothers all watched the captain carefully, knowing that however he answered would be the deciding factor for them. If you do join and decide that, for whatever reason, you want to leave, that would be fine. I would never force someone to stay a part of the crew if they truly didn't want to, Whitebeard said. Now all the brothers needed was Luffy to confirm that Whitebeard had spoken the truth, and when Luffy nodded, telling them they had their answer. Time to see what the outcome of it would be. In that case we agree to join your crew, Sabo said, a hesitant smile on his face as he said the words. Whitebeard, and even Marco smiled back, seeming pleased with the news. Well, that's good news. Welcome aboard my sons, Whitebeard said, filling the brothers with a feeling of peace. There was another feeling along with it, and the best that Ace and Sabo could describe it was the warmth that Luffy always tried to explain. If that's what the feeling was, then they now knew why the feeling was like a drug to Luffy, because Ace and Sabo just wanted more of it. Snapping out of the sensation, Sabo remembered that the brothers had silently agreed to tell them about what had happened in the facility if they joined. Are we still telling them everything? Do you guys want to wait? Sabo asked, not wanting to bring it up if his brothers had changed their minds. I think we should tell them. Luffy replied back a bit nervously because it was nice to have the idea of telling them, but then there was the reality of telling them, and having to, once again, relive their past. If we're joining we may as well. They would find out eventually whether we wanted them to or not. Ace said with a minute shrug that looked as if he was just rolling his shoulders. Sabo nodded, knowing his brother's words were true, and turned to face Whitebeard and Marco. Should we tell the other commanders? Or should we just tell them our powers? Sabo questioned, wanting to know if he should just ask for them to bring in the commanders and get everything over at once, or if they should wait. I don't know. Thatch and Izo are good people, and I think the others are good too, like Namor, but I don't know about everyone else yet. Luffy said, knowing that, like Thatch and Izo, Namor was slowly rising on the list of people he trusted, especially after saving both him and his hat in the water. Despite that though, he hadn't been able to get to know all of the commanders yet, and even though he knew they were good people, they had saved them from the facility, after all, that didn't mean that he trusted them yet. Telling Marco and Whitebeard would mean we would use our powers freely. I think it would be better if we explained everything to all the commanders, so that they don't ask us questions, Ace said, knowing that once they told this once, they wouldn't be in the mood to tell it again. Besides, they would, of course, find out eventually. Are we all sure about this? Sabo asked one last time in case anyone changed their mind last second. The three brothers looked at each other before nodding. Sabo nodded again, turning back to Whitebeard and Marco, who seemed to understand that the brothers were up to something. You, might want to call the other commanders in here, Sabo said, smiling sheepishly as Marco and Whitebeard both raised an eyebrow in interest. The captain nodded, however, sending Marco to call them in. It only took a few moments for all of them to file in, sensing that something important was happening, and it involved the brothers. I'm glad you could all join us. First off, I would like to announce that Ace, Sabo, and Luffy have agreed to become my sons. You brothers. Whitebeard started, the commanders smiling and cheering happily, welcoming the brothers to the family, and Luffy basked in all the sudden happiness in the room, feeling himself becoming slightly giddy in response. Second, I believe the boys have something to say, Whitebeard said, drawing everyone's attention to the brothers who shifted a bit nervously. Sabo closed his eyes to collect himself, taking a deep breath and getting comfortable in his chair, knowing this was going to be a long, hard conversation. Clearing his throat, the blonde opened his eyes, looking at the watching commanders. Yes, we do. Thank you all for being accepting of us, but seeing as we're now part of the crew we thought we should tell you about the facility. About what they've done. Sabo said. The commanders understood that this was a hard subject for them to speak about, and the smiles slipped from their faces, mixed looks of concern, understanding, and seriousness on their faces. I don't think I would be able to tell this twice, so we had everyone come, so we didn't have to repeat it. Sabo continued, Luffy twiddling his thumbs and staring at his hands, rather than looking at the commanders watching them. He had a frown on his face, all the memories flooding back. Anything you don't want to say, you don't have to, Whitebeard said gently, causing Sabo to smile. Truthfully, I don't want to say anything, but it's more of a need to say it really. It would be better if you knew so we don't have to explain later. Sabo said honestly, not wanting to talk about the facility for a third time, but knowing he'd have to if he didn't want to worry about doing it later. Where to begin, Sabo muttered to himself, wondering just how far back he should start. The pirates didn't know about their past like Garp and Shanks did, so he would probably have to explain more than he had to for the other two. Well, Ace, Luffy and I grew up on an island in the East Blue. We aren't blood related, but we're sworn brothers. Garp wasn't always able to come visit us, so whenever he was gone we were left with our caregivers. They weren't exactly watchful, and we normally just took care of ourselves. One day we were out hunting, exploring, and sparring like usual when we were suddenly attacked by 3 men. Sabo began, giving a quick backstory of their home. The group was listening intently, no one missing a single word that came from Sabo's mouth. Of course, we fought them off as best we could. We weren't just going to willingly get kidnapped, but even though we were strong, able to take down most grown men on our home island, we were outmatched here. We had Luffy run back to get our caregiver, but he was never able to reach her before he was caught. He managed to yell for them though, and we were sure the whole island heard the scream. The blonde continued, gauging the reactions of the crew carefully. Luffy was watching the auras of them all, just waiting for a hint of grey to show up, just waiting for malicious feelings towards them to take form. We were taken to a ship and locked in a closet for a while. We think it was a month, but there was no way to tell how long we'd really been in there. We were never let out, there was no light other than what came through the crack under the door, and we were fed just enough to keep us alive. Sabo noticed Thatch's look of anger at the mention, and when Luffy said it wasn't directed towards them, Sabo supposed it was related to why Thatch was so adamant to make sure they ate regularly. Eventually we landed on an island and were dragged out of the room. We stood no chance against the well-fed, trained men, and were easily taken off the boat and to our new captors. The leader of the group was especially glad to see us. Sabo sneered, the brothers all scowling at the memory of Hare. His name was Sabo always had trouble at this part. Why it was so difficult to say his name, he didn't know, but the past 2 times he had to mention it, he barely got the word out. His name was Hare, Sabo said again, this time managing to get the full name out, though it left a bad taste in his name. The brothers noticed the commanders looking to Haruta, seeming to connect the dots as to the reason for why they insisted they call him Ruta. He injected us with something that knocked us unconscious, and took us to what you know as the facility where we were kept for the next 7 years of our lives. We were given our number tattoos and thrown into our cell. The facility, it was hell, to put it bluntly. We had no idea where we were when we woke up, and a child in the cell across from us was kind enough to explain what the place was for us. The memory of the first child they'd seen in the facility, 11,049, floated back to Sabo's mind, the memory of them dying as they were speaking, the memory of no one noticing until days later. He held back the shudder from the memories. They explained that, in the facility, nobody lasts long. On average, your life expectancy was 2 weeks, 3 if you were lucky. They continued to explain to Ace and I that everyone there was a test subject, and the main purpose of the facility was to conduct experiments on those they had taken captive there, us included. Looks of horror and disgust flashed among many of the commanders' faces at the thought, none of them having been expecting that to have been the purpose of the facility. The experiments? Thatch asked carefully, slightly pale. Sabo nodded while Ace crossed his arms, frowning, and Luffy continued keeping check of everyone's emotions and auras, trying his best not to let the memories get the best of him as he did. Yes, experiments. We were now test subjects referred to only by this number on our wrists. We were given breakfast, which wasn't even food if you ask me. Not even good enough to be garbage, Sabo said, face scrunching up in disgust at the memory of how bad the soup had tasted. Ace's face was much similar as he remembered as well, and even Luffy wore a similar look despite the fact that he was concentrating on everyone's feelings and auras. The commanders took notice of this, deciding that they never wanted to know how bad this food actually was. And then we were left alone. Until lunch. The brothers frowned again as the story progressed. When Luffy was little, before he met both Ace and I, he had met Shanks in the village on our island. Shanks had been visiting for a while. I don't know many of the specifics, I never went to the village, but apparently, he had brought a devil fruit with him on the island. One day, while Shanks' crew was partying at the bar that Luffy's caregiver worked at, Luffy was eating and managed to eat the fruit as well, making him a devil fruit user. Sabo explained, looking to his brother who was watching everyone carefully, knowing that this was only one of the many things they were hiding, and if Gray showed up in anyone's auras now, there was no way he was going to share anything else. The look of shock and surprise was on every single one of the commanders' faces, besides Marco's who merely looked interested and slightly confused. Whitebeard had a similar look to Marco's on his face, and no doubt they were all trying to figure out just how they hadn't noticed. The devil fruit. But we saw him fall in the water. Haruta said in shock, everyone nodding their heads along in agreement, equally confused. Sabo smiled a bit as Luffy cleared them all, telling him it was safe to continue. That will be explained shortly. For now, I'll continue where I left off. Luffy had eaten Shanks' fruit, the Gomu Gomu no Mi, making him a rubber man. Sabo said, pulling his brother's cheek in demonstration, the commanders watching with wide, curious eyes as it stretched much further than any normal person's cheek should stretch. Sabo let it go, and it went back to normal with a snap, not even phasing the youngest who had been expecting it. The facility knew about this ability, making Luffy an instant favorite among them. After lunch, which was the same garbage as it always was, he was taken from the cell and dragged to there wasn't really a name for it. We all just called it the lab or the testing room. They did experiments, injected him with unknown drugs, cut him open, anything they could think of really. When they brought him back, he was covered in bandages and only wanted to sleep. Ace was silently fuming, and even Sabo was having trouble keeping calm at the memory of their little brother coming back to them in a less than ideal state. Even the commanders looked angry about it. The next day, we were all taken to testing, along with a few other kids there. Everyone in the facility was the same age range as us. I don't think there was ever anyone over 13 there besides us. That was Ace and I's first day in hell. Ace wasn't awake for most of it, all of the drugs that they injected into him put him to sleep, so he was in and out for most of it. Sabo said, glancing to the oldest who was now digging his nails into his arms. The tests they did to me made me go through waves of pain. Every new injection was a new rush of pain, in my head, in my arms, hands, legs, feet, chest, everywhere. I don't really know what tests they did to Luffy, but they injected him with stuff too before taking him to the table and... Well, anyways Sabo didn't finish, not wanting to remember seeing them cut into his little brother. The commanders were smart, they would be able to connect the dots. And that's how our first year went. We were given drug after drug, and we became lab rats for the doctor's every whim. If they wanted to know something, they figured it out, no matter the cost, no matter the life they needed to take. To them, we were just a disposable resource, one they could replace if needed. The bitterness in the blonde's tone clued the room into how much hatred he felt towards the people at the facility, and, frankly, the commanders were beginning to feel the same way. As the year passed we quickly became famous as the kids who couldn't die. We exceeded the normal life expectancy, and the doctors quickly became fascinated with us because of it. We were the favors, the model test subjects. The fact that Luffy had a devil fruit only made it better to them. We watched children come and go daily, and soon we'd outlived everyone who'd been in there when we first arrived. The first, and only, good thing besides escaping was when we met Emily. Normally the same person would bring us our meals, but one day, Emily brought them instead. She was a nice person, one who didn't agree with what was happening in the facility, and she wanted to help us, and the other trapped children, get out. She used to give us chocolates or fruits whenever she brought us our soup, and she gave us chalk to use in our cell when we were bored. Sabo said fondly, the brothers all calming down at the good memories that surrounded the one person they liked in the facility. The commanders and captain all smiled as well, seeing that this was someone precious to the brothers, and someone who actually seemed to have some humanity in them. She even gave us a map of the entire facility to help us escape. However, like normal, our good luck ran out. Sabo said, tone becoming darker and smile leaving his face. Ace and Luffy's smiles dropped as well, instantly causing everyone else's to as well, already fearing the worst. One of the new tests the doctors had come up with was seeing what would happen to a devil fruit user if they were injected with liquid sea stone. Needless to say, it wasn't pretty. They injected it into Luffy, and he was running a high fever and could barely stay awake. Emily came by and told us she had stolen a cure that the doctors had been developing to flush the sea stone instantly from someone's system. She gave it to us, we injected it into Luffy, and within seconds, he was feeling better. Sabo explained, the commanders and captain listening with rapt attention. Just as Luffy was feeling better, there was a shot, and Emily was hit. Harry had been suspicious of her and had a feeling she would bring us the serum, so, obviously, the next course of action was to kill her. Sabo spat out hatefully. He never thought he could feel more hatred for someone than he did for Harry. The man was pure evil, someone who he wished he had never come across. The rest of the room was filling with anger once again, wondering just how much worse Harry could get. It wasn't often you heard about someone that had such a disregard for human life. After she died, things went back to the way they were before. The guy who used to give us food was back, and it was as if Emily had never existed. That year of testing and experiments slowly went by, and we realized that the doctors were building something. We heard construction happening a lot, but never knew what it was. We found out eventually though when they finally finished building it. They had spent months constructing an entire room that they dubbed the training room. It was made to look like outside, complete with fake grass and blue walls. We were then forced to fight other children that were in the facility. Of course, we resisted at first, we weren't monsters like them, but they had ways of getting us to cooperate. Sabo said, remembering every threat they had been given just so they would beat up some defenseless children for their stupid tests. Our home island was full of abnormally large animals that were easily triple the size of normal animals, and to get food, you had to be strong to take them down. This, of course, meant that we were much stronger than normal children, even after being malnourished and unable to exercise. Sabo said, and he knew that some commanders were beginning to figure out that they weren't all that inexperienced at fighting like they had pretended to be. So, fighting normal, defenseless children was easy, and also something we didn't want to do. However, as mentioned before, we had no choice, so we fought them. Hera promised any child that could defeat us their freedom, promised that if someone could beat us in a fight, they would be free to go. We tried throwing fights, tried letting the other kids win, but Harry was too smart and saw through it every time to the point that he began threatening us again, telling us to no longer throw the fights, or else he would separate us. Sabo said. He could remember the fear he had felt back then, the fear of being separated from his precious brothers, the only ones keeping him sane. No one ever beat us after that. Shortly after the opening of the training room, the doctors began doing a different kind of testing, one that we weren't a part of just yet. They were enhancing children's natural abilities. For example, the first kid that we fought with these enhancements was a kid whose speed had been enhanced. He could move so fast, you couldn't see him. Another kid had extremely fast regenerative abilities to the point that any wound he received was immediately healed before our eyes. Needless to say, they were difficult to take down. Sabo explained. Everyone seemed interested in this new information, wondering just how strong the brothers were to take down people with superhuman abilities. Of course, with all testing that they did, they experimented on us too. They wanted to enhance our senses like they had done with the others. They messed with my ears, enhancing my hearing range. I can hear things extremely far away. Anything anyone says on this ship, I can hear as if I'm standing right there with them. For example, I believe his name is Cedric, has just told Frank that he almost slipped a few minutes ago when running away from Roman. Sabo said, focusing in on the conversation easily, the man talking loudly and boisterously. The commander's eyes widened in shock, and the brothers had to hold in their amusement. You can really hear everything? Namor asked, a slightly skeptical look on his face. Sabo smiled, nodding. I can, Sabo affirmed as the commanders muttered to themselves. So you were listening in on us the entire time? Aizo asked, not mad, but curious. Again, Sabo nodded. Partly, yes. Whenever I heard someone speaking about us, I would listen closely to that conversation to make sure no one here was suddenly going to attack us. I did not, however, listen to anything I knew was confidential. I have no need to invade anyone's privacy, so anything that had nothing to do with us, I tuned out and focused on listening to something else instead. Sabo said, easing the commander's minds. They didn't just enhance my abilities though. They enhanced Ace's eyesight as well, and Luffy's sense of smell too. Ace can see extreme distances with perfect clarity, and can even see in the dark, while Luffy can smell scents that are weeks old, and can distinguish a person by scent alone. He explained, Ace looking slightly grumpy at the attention while Luffy merely gave a toothy grin, laughing a bit. I bet Marco smells like a sweaty sock. Flamingo joked, nudging the first commander with a smile. Meanwhile, Marco glared at him, and the others laughed. No, he smells like ashes and clouds, Luffy said, visibly smelling the air and shocking the commanders. Clouds. What does a cloud smell like? King Du asked curiously. Even Ace and Sabo were curious. They always knew everyone had a distinct scent, allowing Luffy to distinguish who was who, but they'd never asked what anything smelled like. There was no reason to, after all, they would never smell it like Luffy did. Like water, but not really. It's more like a misty smell, but not like the sea mist, cause that's really salty, but like misty water and rain. Luffy tried explaining. Everyone tried imagining the smell, but it was impossible seeing as they couldn't experience it like Luffy. Wait, hold on, that's cool and all, but Ace can't see in the dark, that chast, suddenly remembering that Sabo had mentioned that. It was like a switch was flipped as everyone's eyes turned to Ace, his scowled. Yeah, what about it? He asked, and no one knew what to say about the matter. There was no real way to test if it was true or not at the moment, so they would just have to wait for proof. Anyways, back to the story, Sabo said, directing the attention off of his irritable older brother. At once, everyone remembered how the brothers had gotten these abilities and were immediately engrossed in Sabo's story, wanting and needing to know more. They enhanced our abilities. We couldn't control our newly heightened senses, which left us in a lot of pain for weeks. It was hard at first, to suddenly hear everything like the volume had been turned to 100, and I had migraines from the loud noises until I was able to filter everything to a reasonable noise. Ace was easily susceptible to bright lights, which we were put under nearly daily, and he was able to get eye strain much easier than normal. He also had bad migraines until his eyes finally adjusted. Luffy could smell everything too well, and the overwhelming stench of medicine and alcohol in the lab burned his nose, giving even him headaches. Sabo explained. The commanders realized that, even though the brothers had cool, powerful abilities, they had come at a cost. We were forced to fight a lot more after that. It was our third year there that the next big thing happened. The doctors were a little too excited, which was always bad news, and it turned out that they had gotten their hands on a devil fruit. Of course, who better to give it to than one of the longest-lasting children in the facility? So, they gave it to Ace. The commanders could barely comprehend the fact that the brothers had been able to hide the fact that, not one, but two of them had devil fruits. It was the Mare no Mi, and it allowed Ace to become in control fire. Now that two of us had devil fruits, the doctors were having a field day. Apparently. That also meant they were ready to do riskier experiments. And suddenly Ace and Luffy were both frowning again, a wave of deep anger and hatred flaming in Ace's eyes at whatever Sabo was going to tell the commanders. Sabo sighed, knowing it had been a traumatizing experience for them all. They injected me with a lot of drugs, to put it lightly. I guess whatever they gave me didn't mix well because I was suddenly getting really hot and they started to freak out a bit. I don't remember much except the fact that they began clearing the room and started getting a lot of things out. Sabo said, the memory hazy. He had died after all. They kept talking about your vitals or whatever dropping. And BP, whatever that means. Ace muttered darkly, the words ingrained in his head, remembering how he had fought to stay in the room, once he realized just how wrong Sabo's test had gone. Everyone frowned at Ace's words, and they all began to realize where this was going. The drugs had been too much for me, I guess, and I ended up dying. Of course, being a favorite among the doctors had only one single benefit, and that was that they would do anything to bring me back to life. Obviously, they were able to do just that seeing as I'm here right now, but they did keep me there overnight to make sure I was okay. Sabo said, and the room was once again surprised that the blonde had actually died in that place. Of course, they knew they shouldn't be surprised by anything that happened there anymore, not after everything they'd already heard, but it couldn't be helped. They had a feeling it was only going to get worse from here. Chapter 57. The second half. There was a tense silence in the room as they waited for Sabo to continue the story of the brothers' experience in the facility. Then year 4 came. Sabo started, taking a deep breath. He knew this was a long story, and they were only a little halfway through it, but he was becoming exhausted with living through these memories once again. Year 4 definitely comes in second for being our worst year there. It started normally, with tests one after the other, but then they began doing tests exclusively on Ace and Luffy. These tests were devil fruit based, and they would drop them in tanks of water, forcing them to hold their breath as long as they could, and only stopping once they'd reached an acceptable 5 minutes. Sabo said with a grimace, remembering sitting in his cell and hearing Haru berate them, pushing them back in over and over again until they did. But humans can't hold their breath that long, Namor said in confusion, causing Ace to scoff and Luffy to look down, kicking his feet against the floor. Yeah, well, these humans can thanks to that insane bastard. Ace said, jutting a thumb out to point to Luffy and himself, remembering how his vision had been spotted with black, and the lack of oxygen had made him dizzy. It wasn't long after they'd been returned to the cell that there was an explosion. The doctors had been working on something and it backfired, causing a massive fire to roll through the halls and begin killing the children locked in their cells. The brothers once again had dark looks in their eyes, remembering the screams. It eventually got to our cell as well, and I was honestly convinced we were going to die. At this point, both Ace and Luffy were restrained with sea stone constantly because the doctors feared that, without it, they would be able to do some serious damage. And they were right. This meant, however, that they were constantly in a weakened state, and now we were in a cell with no escape and a roaring fire coming our way. Ace managed to control the fire despite being held in sea stone, and kept it from harming us, thanks to a drug the doctors had used on him earlier that day. I'm pretty sure the doctors were convinced we were unable to die. Sabo said, and it seemed that way. It was deathly silent as the commanders and captain took in the information, knowing there was still more years to come, and apparently an even worse year according to Sabo, but it seemed as if this was something you would hear in a work of fiction, not in real life. Due to the fire, all of the children being held captive were killed, along with a few doctors too, and they had to restock the entire facility. Within the time of having no children to spar against, they opted to just do regular tests on us. They did specific ones on Ace and Luffy to the point where they can both hold their breath for 10 minutes, and last another 2 after that before passing out. They can also resist the effects of the oceans for 2 minutes, which means that they can tread water in that time, until they become too weak to do it anymore, explaining how Luffy was able to misdirect you into thinking he could swim. Sabo explained. I didn't think anything like that was possible, Marco said, clearly intrigued by the aspect. Sabo chuckled dryly at that. Yeah, well, they had a knack for making the impossible possible, he said before deciding to continue on with the story. It had already been extremely lengthy so far, more so than it had been when they told Shanks or Garp. The tests they did also allowed Ace and Luffy to have better control over their fruit, even when in Sea Stone, and somewhere along the way they had given Ace a more mild version of what they had given the child with regenerative abilities. Ace heals much faster than normal, but not instantaneously like the other child had. Deep wounds that take weeks to heal only take a few days instead. Understanding showed again as they realized this was how Ace had baffled Whiskey, when his wound had miraculously healed at an exceptional rate. Year 5 was the year of even more tragedy. They, like usual, were testing on us, and they decided to try a new test on Luffy. One involving poison. They injected multiple types of poison into him, with the idea of creating an antidote that could cure multiple types of poisons at once. Long story short, it didn't go well. Like with me, Luffy began failing fast, and they had us all taken out while they tried to use the antidote. It didn't work, and Luffy died for a few minutes to the point that they gave up trying to revive him, but as they were cleaning up the antidote worked and he was alive again. The commanders shared a look as they realized that not one, but 2 of them had died at the hands of the doctors, not to mention, they had nearly died multiple times throughout this whole experience as well. Then, the worst year came. Year 6. Sabo began, looking over at Luffy. Every other time he told this story, this was the part where Luffy left. In fact, Ace was already nearly out of his chair in anticipation, waiting for Luffy to stand and leave. The commanders and captain watched, understanding that something bad, something worse than everything else, was coming up. But Luffy didn't stand, and although he looked like he wanted to leave, he remained seated. Are you sure, Lu? Sabo asked softly, not knowing if he should continue with Luffy in the room. It had always been hard for Luffy to come to terms with what had happened during that year. He had changed drastically because of it, and it was almost like they had left him with the husk of their brother, after what they had put him through. He was only just beginning to heal from it, and now he was about to sit and hear about it all over again. I wanna stay to watch the colors to make us sure, Luffy said in a shaky, hesitant voice. He was clearly divided on this decision, and the older 2 could understand why. Luffy was the only one who knew if the commanders and captain would be affected by this story, and if he left, Sabo would be left alone with them, with no way of knowing if they were going to turn on him because of what happened during that year. But on the other hand, it was an extremely painful thing for Luffy to go through again, even if it was just words retelling a memory he had replaying constantly in his mind. If you have to leave, don't worry, just leave, Sabo said, grabbing Luffy's hand as he spoke. He knew that Luffy would try and stick it out, but Sabo wanted him to know that, at any time, he could leave. Even if Sabo wouldn't have the advantage of knowing how the commanders were feeling, or if their auras suddenly turned gray, he would rather be stuck in here with them, than force Luffy to relive a past he's still having a hard time coming to terms with. Ace seemed to share his sentiment because he grabbed Luffy's other hand, giving it a comforting squeeze. Prepared for the worst, Sabo drew his attention back to the waiting commanders and captain, getting ready to tell their story once more. Year 6. It started out normally. We had learned about hockey when we were forced to fight, so throughout the beginning of that year, we trained even more in it. We sparred, we were tested on, and we were the perfect test subjects. Everything was the same as it had always been until the doctors once again came up with a new test. The commanders and captain listened closely, a heavy tension filling the room as anticipation grew within them. They took Luffy, only Luffy, and brought him in for testing. We don't know what drug they gave him, but the effects were immediate. Whatever they gave him also gave him the ability to see someone's entire memories by just looking into their eyes. From birth to present. Sabo explained. Noticing the wide, nervous eyes on Sabo smiled. Don't worry, he's not exactly fond of going through people's histories like that. At first, he had no control over it, and had to stare at the ground a lot, but he learned to control it, so that he can look into eyes without worrying about it. There were sighs of relief from some of the commanders who didn't exactly want their pasts to be known without their permission. That wasn't all they did though. The doctors had created a series of tests that they wanted to try out, and that was only the first one. The next one, another injection, gave him the ability to feel people's emotions. Whatever they're feeling, he can sense it. That one, he can't exactly just turn off. Sabo said, rubbing the back of his head as the commanders came to terms with his words. What, so he can feel what I'm feeling then? Vista asked, a single eyebrow raised skeptically. Sabo nodded, tightening his grip on Luffy's hand, Ace doing the same. Before he could speak further on the matter, Luffy spoke up instead. You're confused. All of you are, and some of you are worried about us. There's also anger, but it's not directed at us, it's directed at the facility. There's also a lot of warmth, but I'm being careful with it. Luffy said, saying the last bit more to Ace and Sabo rather than the others, to reassure them that he wasn't going to let it influence him. Warmth? Flamingo asked, confused. He was willing to bet that what Sabo had said was true, and that Luffy really could feel their emotions, but what kind of emotion was warmth? That, we don't know much about. We know that good people can possess another emotion which Luffy can only describe as warm and nice, and Captain Whitebeard possesses a lot of it. Sabo said, nodding to the captain who was listening with interest. It's a particularly nice feeling to Luffy. Anyone feeling an emotion strong enough can influence the way Luffy feels. Say, for example, one of you got really angry right now. Luffy would feel that feeling, and it would begin to influence the way he feels, making him inexplicably angry, even if he had been quite cheerful a moment ago. For Luffy it's hard to not let in feelings of happiness because, in his words, they're nice feelings, and they feel good to let in. This, however, means that he gets easily influenced by them. Sabo began explaining, the commanders and captain trying to keep up. This warm feeling is like a drug to Luffy, Sabo said, trying to find the right way to explain this. In large quantities, Luffy can easily let that feeling overwhelm him. You've all seen it happen before, in fact. There were more looks of confusion as the room tried to figure out what Sabo meant. The blonde smiled, chuckling a bit. When we were in the galley eating, Luffy had felt for the first time that one of you possessed a large quantity of the feeling. He had stopped eating and was looking around trying to pinpoint who had the feeling, and it turned out to have been Whitebeard. He'd never experienced that much warmth at once. Ace and I also possess the feeling, but we can't produce as much as Whitebeard can. Luffy let too much of it in, and he became so relaxed by the feeling, so influenced by it, that he began falling asleep. Luffy smiled sheepishly, remembering when he had scared everyone when they thought he was hurt. I remember that. You said he was just tired and you took him to your room. We thought something was wrong. Jiru said. Ace scoffed again while Sabo just nodded. Exactly. Ever since then Luffy's made sure to limit how much warmth he allows in. It's good in small quantities, and Ace and I make sure to send him some to calm him down, but we have to limit how much we give him. Now, as I mentioned before, warmth is a feeling that only good people can possess. In spite of that, there is a feeling that only bad people can possess. Sabo said grimly, frowning along with the brothers as the room became tense once more. We don't have a good name for this feeling either, but Luffy describes it as a darkness. A heavy, suffocating, slimy feeling that he doesn't like. We've only found a few people outside of the facility that possesses this feeling. Harry had an abundance of it as well, and it was difficult for Luffy to block the feeling from coming in. The blonde explained. We'll get to that later though. For now, let's discuss the last test. The worst one. All of these tests fell under a single experiment that the doctors were running, an experiment that they called the Pure Souls experiment. This last test made it understandable as to what this meant. After another injection, Luffy began seeing colors around people. They ranged from a light blue to gray to completely pitch black. I overheard the doctors saying that he was now able to see auras, and that they were a representation of someone's soul. It didn't take long to figure out that the light blue, which only surrounded me, Ace, and the rest of the children, meant those people had good souls, while the darker and grayer it got, the worse the soul was. Needless to say, Harry's color was completely black. Ace scowled at that while Luffy shrunk back in his seat. What about Teach, Yuri? Marco suddenly asked, and Sabo had to commend the man on his intelligence, as he and Ace shared a look, Luffy sinking even further back. Ah, that. We'll get to that, but let's just say, it's a good thing you took our warning to heart, Sabo said with a half-smile, while the other commanders looked around in confusion. Teach. What about him? Is he alright? Thatch asked with concern, and the brothers knew that that concern was misplaced. Again, we'll get to that, don't worry. Anyways, Luffy was able to see people's souls, and like seeing people's pasts, he could turn off the ability to see the colors. The final thing, though, was what the doctors called bridging. Sabo said solemnly, and Luffy shivered, knowing what was coming next. The commanders noticed, and they didn't like it one bit. Are you sure you don't want to leave, Luffy? Ace asked, squeezing his brother's hand in hopes to give him a bit of comfort. And no one wanna stay, Luffy muttered quietly, looking at the commanders and captain's colors, watching for even a speck of gray. Ace and Sabo frowned, sending each other another look before Sabo hesitantly continued on. Well, the doctors wanted Luffy to bridge his soul to other children's souls. Connect them. They sent children in, had Luffy try and create the bridge, but it didn't work. No matter how many children they tried, every time Luffy would try, the child would be in immense pain until they ended up well dying. Sabo said, trying to be as gentle as possible, knowing that Luffy was going to have a difficult time hearing this. They forced him to keep trying it on more and more children, until they finally ended up sending Ace in. They made him try it on Ace, but instead of dying, it was successful. Luffy had bridged to Ace and, in doing so, created what Luffy calls a wave. Luffy can see a wave connecting him to Ace no matter where he is. They had him try a few more times on other children, but they all died as well until they had him do it with me. Obviously, it was also successful and he was able to create a wave with me as well. Ace and I can't see these waves, only Luffy can. We don't know if there's a range to them seeing as we've been together ever since, but they do seem to be linked to our health. The closer we get to dying, the more transparent the wave becomes. Luffy managed to sit through the entire thing, but that didn't mean he was unaffected by it. He had been allowing himself to let in warmth from Whitebeard, helping to cease the painful thoughts running through his mind about how much of a monster he was. It helped that Ace and Sabo were both right there with him, holding his hands tightly and sending him their own pulses of warmth. I wish I'd been able to fight more doctors, Atmos muttered darkly, all of them feeling the familiar burning of hatred for the doctors, that they had let off a little too easy now that they knew everything they had done to poor defenseless children. Trust me, no one wants to fight them more than we do. Ace growled out, his free hand clenched tightly into a fist. Sabo sighed but didn't say anything to disagree. The doctors found that Luffy had to know and trust the person he created the bridge with, or else it would fail. After that Luffy became much more distant. It was harder to get any response out of him really. The only thing we had to look forward to was year 7. We had promised, back when Emily died, that we would escape when Ace and I were 17. If we couldn't manage it, then who knows what we would have done. We worked on making escape plans for years, and it was all finally going to happen. Sabo said, his tone becoming lighter as he remembered the fact that they weren't there anymore. They had escaped. Ace and I knew it would be difficult to escape, what with all the guards and doctors, and not to mention the extreme disadvantage we were seeing as Ace and Luffy were cuffed in sea stone 24/7, and the fact that we were all only fed the same gross soup for our meals. We only really planned on getting Luffy out, of course, we didn't tell him that. Sabo said, ruffling Luffy's hair, ignoring the glare Luffy sent him. The youngest still wasn't happy that they had done that. And it managed to work. Luffy got out, but Ace and I were caught. It was pure luck that Luffy managed to find you on the island. The rest, you know. Sabo finished, taking a deep breath, knowing that there was still many questions and things they needed to discuss. There was silence for a moment as everyone processed the lengthy story. That was unexpected, but I'm glad you three made it out of that situation, Whitebeard said sincerely, Ace and Luffy nodding to him, while Luffy allowed himself to absorb a little more of the warmth from the man. I understand that you guys have some more questions. We'll try and answer them if we can. Sabo said honestly, and there was an uproar as everyone began speaking at once, all of them wondering something different. One at a time, Yoi, Marco said, calming the group back down, muttering apologies. So you guys do know hockey? Thatch asked, the question having been bothering him for weeks. Sabo laughed, having known about Thatch's curiosity about that. Yes, Thatch, you were right all that time that we knew hockey, but that's not how I always knew you were at the door. I could hear you coming. Thatch looked triumphant about that. Even if he wasn't exactly right, he had been right in the end. Luffy has Cooker's hockey too, right? I remember him using it when we rescued you guys. Aizo said, and Sabo frowned a bit, nodding. Yes, he does, though that was the first time he's ever used it. Ace possesses it as well. He's had a bit of practice with it but not much. Sabo said, Ace muttering about it not being a big deal when everyone gave them looks of shock. That's impressive, but what was it you mentioned about the warning about Teach? Jozu asked, and the brothers became grim again. Teach isn't a good guy. He's got the bad color and the bad feelings. Luffy said darkly, shivering at the memory of the feelings. Luffy noticed it before Teach even arrived on the Mobi. Teach has a strong feeling of darkness, and not to mention his aura is almost darker than hers. Sabo explained with a frown. Ace was glaring at the table, doing his best not to start cursing the bastard. Really? Are you sure? Curiel asked, and Sabo understood why he was asking. After all, these were people who had probably been with the man for years with no suspicion that he was a bad guy. Of course we are, that damn bastard's planning something and I don't like it. Ace growled out angrily, wishing he could punch the man already and get it over with. Sure, Teach hadn't done anything yet, but he would, there was no doubt about that. Ace? Sabo hissed, trying to keep his brother from angering them. Don't mind him, he gets irritated easily. But it's true, Teach is definitely going to do something sooner or later, and whatever it is, it won't be good. When we warned you about him, we didn't know yet if we were going to stay. When Teach came, we were actually prepared to leave, because nothing good comes with staying near someone with that level of darkness, but seeing as you took our warning seriously, we decided to stay. Sabo said to Whitebeard and Marco who were both frowning in thought. Seeing as he's yet to do anything, we won't do anything either. However, I want everyone here to keep a close eye on him. Don't let him know we're suspicious of him, but don't let him do anything that we don't know about. Whitebeard ordered firmly, everyone nodding their agreement. Another silence lapsed over the room as everyone took in this information before Marco spoke up. You three tap a lot, Bjorn. He started, saying the words more as a fact than a question. Sabo smiled, remembering his previous thought that the man was extremely smart. We do, and I know you've been curious about it, Sabo said plainly, already knowing what the question would be. The commanders watched in confusion, some having noticed them tapping a few times while others hadn't noticed at all. Why? At first, I thought it was a habit or a nervous tic, Bjorn, but I never knew for sure. Marco said, arms crossed over his chest. Actually, it's none of that. In the facility, we were always around other people, unless we were in our cell, and even then, noises echoed easily in those halls, so to make sure no one caught on to our escape plan, we learned how to communicate silently to each other. Through a series of taps and other noises, Ace, Luffy and I can have full conversations without having to speak to, or even see, each other. Sabo explained, rapping his fingers on the table a few times. No way, so you've been having conversations right in front of us and we had no clue? Rikuo asked in amazement. The brothers all grinned proudly, nodding. And these idiots were none the wiser. Ace tapped in amusement, making sure it was clear to everyone that he was communicating to his brothers. Luffy laughed to himself while Sabo smiled, tempted to laugh as well, but opting instead to hit his brother's shoulder. Ace, be nice, it's not like they had reason to believe that's what we were doing. Sabo scolded lightly, only making Ace snicker. What did he say? Fasa asked, the commanders watching curiously, all wanting to know as well. Oh, nothing all that important, Sabo said with a smirk, the commander's only more curious now. Man, I wish I knew how to talk in a cool secret language like that, Haruda grumbled. That's cool and all, but you guys said you didn't know how to fight. Obviously, that was a lie, but why lie in the first place? Blenheim asked, not angry, just curious. Surprise, Luffy said simply, confusing the commanders. Surprise? Atmos asked uncertainly. Sabo sighed, ruffling Luffy's hair. What he means is the element of surprise. Understand that we had gone from one horrible situation and had been forced into an unknown one within a matter of hours. Not to mention, we were on a pirate ship known notoriously throughout the world for being bloodthirsty and greedy. Sabo began to elaborate. Yeah, but those are all lies. Unless they're talking about our fights with pirates that attack our territory. Namor said, and Sabo nodded. Yes, we know that now, but there was no way for us to know that at the time. The only way we had to defend ourselves was to keep our abilities a secret, so that, in the event that you really were those bloodthirsty pirates, we would be able to use the element of surprise to shock you a bit and help us escape. Honestly, if we suddenly use fire and rubber attacks against you, as well as decent fighting skills, how surprised would you have been? Sabo asked, and he could see the commanders agreeing with the logic. It sure as heck would stop me in my tracks for a minute. Jozu murmured, the others nodding their agreement. Yeah, you three put up a pretty good act of having no fighting skill whatsoever. Not to mention, no devil fruits as well. King Du added. Exactly, which is why we didn't come out right and tell you all that we could fight. We tested you though, and found that you were trustworthy enough to tell you all of this. Sabo explained, only causing further confusion. Tested us? Thatch asked. MHMM. Tested your reaction to certain things, pushed a few buttons, listened to see if anyone turned us into the Marines. One of them was supposed to be knocking a bucket over and seeing what the reaction was, and even though we did just that, it hadn't exactly gone according to plan. Sabo said sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head. You mean when Luffy tripped on the bucket? Aizo asked, and Sabo nodded. Yeah. Sure, we planned on doing just that, but Luffy had been resting before we did, and none of us realized he'd actually fallen asleep. Whenever we're just waking up, our senses are oversensitive, and we can be overwhelmed quite easily because of it. When we walked out, the smell of the cleaning supplies disoriented Luffy, and he really tripped over the bucket. Sabo said, Ace shaking his head, still not sure how none of them realized Luffy was being overwhelmed. Then was what happened with Vander Decken true? That you just found him drowning? Juru asked, all of the commanders having been skeptical of the story from the beginning, but having no reason to think that wasn't what had happened. No, it wasn't. We knew it wasn't exactly the best story, but it was either that or tell you all everything, which we were not ready to do. While Luffy wandered off at the palace, I heard Princess Shirahashi crying. We were concerned and didn't know what to make of it, so we went to her room where we had a conversation with her, eventually finding out about Vander Decken. We promised we'd take care of it, so the next day we went out looking for him. I heard someone talking outside of the bubble around Fishman Island, and Ace could see their ship, so we snuck onto a leaving merchant's boat and went to Decken himself. He was apparently a pirate captain as well, so Luffy and I took down his remaining crew after Ace used his haki, and Ace went after Decken. Sabo said, giving a quick retelling of the fight, which hadn't been all that exciting honestly. The guy talked too much for how weak he was. Ace grumbled, still grumpy about the lack of a fight that Decken had put up. So you three took down a New World pirate crew alone, Rikuo said in shock, the brothers nodding. To be honest, I think they were just lucky no one had found them sooner. They weren't all that remarkable. Sabo said with a shrug. Yeah, and I didn't even get to fight Dell and Luffy said with a pout, confusing the commanders. Decken, Luffy. Nicknames, remember? Sabo said with a sigh, wondering if Luffy would ever learn. I know, but Alan was a bad guy so I don't feel bad about saying his name wrong, Luffy said defiantly, and Sabo guessed it was better than nothing. Alan, really Lou? That sounds nothing like Decken. Ace said with a bit of laughter. Luffy only smiled up at his older brother, not responding. What about when Ace fell asleep when you were walking? Izo asked, the event having scared many of the crew when they thought that something might be wrong, but Whiskey had assured them that everything was fine. Oh, that. Well, Ace has narcolepsy. He's had it ever since he was born. He's prone to what we call sleep attacks and can fall asleep at any moment really. It's sudden, but there are normally warning signs before it happens. It just so happened that Ace was only having his attacks in our room or when we were sitting down. Marco actually witnessed one before. Sabo explained, the first mate easily knowing what they were talking about. I remember, Yuri. He slumped and hit his head on the railing. Marco said, and Sabo nodded. That's right. The attacks were worse in the facility, but now they're beginning to even out again. If he doesn't sleep well he's more prone to them, or if he's put into a high emotional state, but for the most part they're random and unpredictable. Sabo said, the commanders all nodding in understanding. There was silence after that as everyone took a minute to think of any more questions. When no one spoke up again, Whitebeard cleared his throat, looking to the brothers. Thank you for telling us everything, despite how hard it must have been, and welcome to the crew. He said simply, ending the meeting as the brothers smiled back to him, Luffy letting himself bask in the warmth a bit. That's right. I've gotta go cook a feast to celebrate the fact that it's official now. Thatch said excitedly, standing up and leaving the room, mumbling to himself about what he could cook. The other commanders laughed at the man, but also welcomed the brothers before leaving the room. The trio were the second to last to get up, only Marco and Whitebeard left in the room. I like it here. We should stay for a while. Luffy said matter-of-factly as they walked to the door. That's kind of the point of joining, Lou. Ace said, ruffling Luffy's hair. Oh, right. See you later Mr. Whitebeard, Marco. Luffy said with a grin, walking out the door with Ace and Sabo right behind him. I sense there will be interesting events in our future with those three, Whitebeard said with a smile. I've already got enough paperwork, let's not make it more, Yui, Marco said in a grumble. Whitebeard didn't say anything to that, merely laughing at his first mate. Chapter 58. Telling Whiskey. The whole story of the brothers' past took Sabo so long to tell that by the time he finished talking, it was time for lunch. Thatch was still muttering about a feast for dinner, but in the meantime, everyone was heading to the galley to eat and then move on with the day. The brothers followed the lunch crowd, some of the crew giving them and the commanders curious looks seeing as they had spent most of the morning in the meeting room talking. They sat at their table with the captain and commanders, ignoring the looks, and thanked Thatch as he set their food down in front of them. The chef said a quick no problem before rushing off to the kitchen. We have to talk to Whiskey too. Luffy tapped out as he ate, although he looked a bit uncomfortable with the idea. Sabo sighed, knowing his brother was right, while Ace scowled. Why? I want to stay as far away from her as possible. Ace replied with a huff. Sabo nudged his brother lightly, sending a light glare to him. Ace, we're part of the crew now, you can't just go saying things like that anymore. He reprimanded, knowing that they would still have their qualms about the nurses, but that didn't mean they had to voice them. It would be preferable if the crew didn't think they hated their nurses, and they didn't, they merely had a distaste of them was all. Nothing personal. Yeah, and we promised we'd tell her stuff after we joined. Luffy tapped with a bit of a frown. When it came to promises, Luffy didn't take them lightly. None of the brothers did. Fine, we can go talk to her after this. Ace replied grudgingly. At this point, the brothers were acutely aware of the fact that the commanders had noticed their silent conversation, watching with wide curious eyes, as they tried deciphering whatever it was the brothers were saying to each other. Sabo held back his laughter as he noticed this, tapping to his brothers again. Thank you. Now Ace, do a flip for the crowd. Really wow them. Sabo tapped playfully, only earning another glare from the hot head, while Luffy laughed loudly, clearly enjoying himself as he continued eating. Still lost, the commanders watched on. I wish I knew a cool secret language, Haruta mumbled again as he watched, wondering just what the brothers were saying. It would make it easier to communicate with Marines around. Atmos agreed. At this point, Thatch was returning from the kitchen, his food in his hand. I'm here. What did I miss? He asked as he sat down, smiling gleefully. Luffy felt himself grinning wider as he felt the happy emotions, feeling a little giddy himself now. Nothing much, the brothers are just speaking amongst themselves, Izo said with a smile, gesturing to the still tapping brothers. Oh hey, you think you guys could teach me some of that? Thatch asked the brothers, resting his chin in his hand as he leaned forward eagerly. Sabo laughed at the chef's eagerness while Ace scoffed, and Luffy smiled. The commanders also looked interested, not having thought of just outright asking. I don't know, the point of something being secret is that other people don't know about it, Sabo said, pretending to look as if he was seriously considering it. But we could teach them the easy ones. Like, be careful, or be quiet. Oh, and you stink. Luffy piped up, and Ace and Sabo could tell that someone was probably influencing the young teen's emotions a bit, the boy seemingly too giddy for the moment. I suppose we could, it would help if we needed to tell them. Also, Luffy, calm down a bit. Sabo said, messing Luffy's hair up and making the boy pout a bit. But there are so many happy feelings. It's nice. Luffy whined but tried to calm down, forcing himself to not let in as much of the happiness as he had been a few seconds ago. Yeah, but we don't want you bouncing off the walls because of it, Ace said offhandedly, shoving another sandwich into his mouth. Luffy pouted but agreed to tone down how much happiness he let in, deciding to allow some of the warmth in instead to help him calm down. Pleased, Sabo turned back to Thatch. As Luffy said, we could probably teach you guys some of the easier, more cautionary ones. For example, be careful. Sabo said, tapping the words out as the commanders watched on with interest. Like this. Thatch asked, tapping, though his taps were a tad too slow, and instead of, be careful the chef had accidentally tapped out, with kittens instead. Ace choked on his third sandwich as a laugh forced its way out, and Luffy smiled again, giggling quietly as well. Thatch blinked, looking between the brothers. What? What did I say? He asked, wondering what was so funny. Sabo merely smiled, shaking his head. It was nothing, don't worry. You just tapped a bit too slow, which changed the words completely. If you don't tap as fast as this, Sabo said, demonstrating once again the proper way to convey the words. Then the meaning changes, Sabo said, and Thatch nodded in understanding, becoming more determined as he tried the words out again. So, like this. Thatch said, trying it again, doing it the way Sabo had shown him. The blonde nodded as Luffy and Ace watched the tapping, easily deciphering it to be the words the chef had been attempting to tap. Exactly, just like that. Sabo praised Thatch, beaming proudly after his success. What's the next one? I bet I'll learn it no problem. He boasted, a determined smile on his face as the other commanders around him laughed and rolled their eyes. Sabo was reminded of when he was teaching Ace and Luffy how to read, Ace determined to be the best at it, while Luffy merely wanted to learn because it was the only source of entertainment for him. Well, I could teach you, be quiet. Sabo mused, wondering which one to teach next. There were a few cautionary phrases that would be beneficial to teach the commanders, it was just a matter of which ones to teach first. Teaching Thatch to be quiet. Not gonna happen. Atmos rumbled jokingly, causing another round of laughter. Thatch responded with a playful glare. I think you're just jealous that I'm learning a cool language and you're not. Thatch teased, in turn making Atmos to return the glare. I'm not, look, I got it. The commander said, all eyes on him as he tapped on the table. Within seconds, Ace and Sabo were choking on their food, while Luffy looked on with a look of confusion. Ace and Sabo both had white eyes, jaws dropped a bit at whatever Atmos had said. What did he say? Haruta asked, everyone, even Marco and Whitebeard concerned. The looks on Ace and Sabo's faces told them enough to know that it was anything but good. And nothing, it's just. Sabo, Ace, what's a big Ace and Sabo simultaneously slapped their hands over Luffy's mouth, stopping him from saying whatever it was he was about to say. Luffy, you should eat so we can go talk to Whiskey sooner. You know, don't want to keep her waiting. Ace said in a bit of a rushed voice. The commanders were left to imagine what Atmos had said as Luffy nodded, turning to eat the rest of his food. If what Atmos had said was bad enough that Ace was ready to go talk to a nurse, it had to have been pretty bad. Sabo cleared his throat, slowly getting over his shock as he realized that they should be careful when teaching the commanders any more phrases with Luffy around. Anyways, like with Thatch, you gotta tap at the right pace. Yours was a bit too, fast, Sabo explained, still trying to get the words Atmos had unknowingly tapped out of his head. It must have been hard to learn and make up this language, as something like the speed of tapping can change the entire sentence, Recreo noted as Thatch taught Atmos the proper speed to tap. We had lots of time to practice. Ace muttered to the man as he finished his lunch, Luffy and Sabo finishing soon after as well. There's only so many different ways to tap. The only other way to make up new words was to find new ways to tap, and for us, that meant using the speed to our advantage. It's harder to decipher taps that all look the same. Sabo said as the brothers stood up, ready to go speak with Whiskey. If you want to learn more I can help you after we speak with Whiskey, Sabo told Thatch and nodded. The brothers left after that, no one asking why the brothers were going to talk with the nurse. It only took a few minutes to make their way to the infirmary, and soon they were pushing the door open, trying to ignore the anxiety rising in all of them. Luffy's nose twitched at the burning smells filling his senses, while Ace scanned the room, finding the nurse almost immediately, and leading his brothers towards her. Ace, Sabo, Luffy, what can I do for you? She asked, turning to look at them with a smile after another nurse told her they were heading her way. Hello Whiskey, we're here to uphold our end of a promise, Sabo replied, making Whiskey raise an eyebrow in confusion. Oh? And what promise would that be? She asked, holding a clipboard to her chest as she spoke. We did say that once we joined the crew officially we would tell you everything you should know about us, Sabo said with a smile. Whiskey, realizing what this meant, only nodded, turning to the nurse she had been talking to when they had walked in. I'll be back. Can you make sure Oyaji takes these for once? He avoided it yesterday. Whiskey said with a hint of aggravation in her voice as she handed over a pill bottle to the pink-haired nurse. There was a nod from the other nurse who scurried off, presumably to Whitebeard, while Whiskey turned to them. Come on, let's go to my office, we'll have more privacy there. The nurse said, already beginning to walk out of the infirmary. The three brothers shared a look, wondering if they should follow her. They were still highly distrustful of doctors and nurses, even if they were part of the same crew now, so who's to say that she wasn't luring them away to finally attack them? But those were thoughts that they would have to start getting over. Sure, most of the world was after them and would be after them for the rest of their lives, but that didn't mean there weren't a select few that were on their side. They just had to get used to the fact that, maybe, this crew was one of those select few, and these nurses were ones they could trust. That trust wasn't going to be something that came easy though. Reluctantly, the brothers decided to follow the nurse out of the room they hated. They only walked a few doors down before she opened one up and let them in. The room had filing cabinets along the entire back wall and a desk facing the door, which Whiskey went to sit at, pulling out some papers and putting them out in front of her. The brothers hesitantly walked into the room, Sabo and Luffy sitting at the two chairs in front of the desk, while Ace stood in between them, arms crossed over his chest. Sorry, there's not a lot of room in here. This is mostly just so we have a place to store our records on crew members, and seeing as I'm the head nurse, they made it my office to give me a bit more space for my notes. Whiskey explained. It's fine, we wouldn't be too long I don't think, Sabo said truthfully, not thinking this talk would take too long. It's not like they were telling their entire history as they'd done with the commanders in Whitebeard. Whenever you want to begin, you can. She said, holding a pen to the paper as she got ready to write. Sabo nodded, wondering how he should phrase some things. He couldn't just say they all had heightened senses without questions being asked. Well, to begin with, you know Ace has narcolepsy, he's had it ever since he was born. Sabo started, Whiskey nodding. None of us have any more medical conditions like that, but the facility gave us different abilities that normal people don't possess, Sabo said, picking his words carefully. Whiskey raised an eyebrow at this. Like? She asked, deciding not to question exactly how the facility had given the brothers these abilities. Like our senses. My hearing has been heightened to the point that I can hear things extremely far away. Sabo said as Whiskey wrote something down. Alright, do you know just how far you can hear? She asked, not looking up from her paper. Not exactly. A quarter mile. Maybe a bit more. Sabo guessed, not really having measured it before. Whiskey nodded as she wrote that down. Is everything louder? Or is everything the same volume, you can just hear further away? Whiskey looked up, her appearance giving away nothing but a calm, professional exterior. Everything's louder. Whispers sound like normal talking is like shouting. Sabo said, having come to terms with that long ago, back in the facility. It had been painful for everyone to sound like they were constantly shouting, and it took a while for Sabo to figure out how to talk normally without whispering, thinking that was normal, but it had all evened out in the end. How long ago was it that your hearing was enhanced? Sabo thought about it, knowing that it had happened sometime during their second year in the facility. Around 5 years ago. He answered dutifully. Did you have more related injuries or illnesses since then? And Sabo had to consider that one because, after all, that the doctors had done, it was hard to determine what was illness, and what was the result of a bad drug. I don't know, I don't think so. When my hearing was first heightened everything was too loud to listen to, and I got headaches a lot because of it, but I don't think I've had any other problems besides that. Sabo responded. Okay, I think that's it. What else? Whiskey asked, looking up from her notes with a hint of a smile to reassure the brothers. Well, at the same time that they enhanced my hearing, they also enhanced Luffy's sense of smell and Ace's eyesight, Sabo explained. Whiskey nodded, pulling out a different paper from under the stack and setting it on top. In that case, we'll start with Luffy. You said it was the same time, so that was 5 years ago. The head nurse said, more to herself as she wrote it down before continuing. Why don't you explain to me what your senses are like so I know what to ask? Whiskey said, giving Luffy a more noticeable smile, knowing that the brothers were still easily scared of nurses. I can figure out who someone is by the way they smell, and I can follow someone's smell to figure out where they're at too, Luffy said, not the best at explaining things, but doing his best. Alright, does that mean everyone has a particular scent that you can recognize? Whiskey asked, needing a bit of elaboration. Luffy hummed an affirmation, and she wrote some more before asking more questions. How long does it normally take until you can't follow someone's scent anymore? She asked, and like Sabo, Luffy hadn't really had much practice with it to know, but he remembered Sabo saying that he overheard the doctors talking about that before. A week I think. He responded uncertainly. And like I asked Sabo, does everything smell stronger than before, or does it smell the same, you can just smell more now? Whiskey asked. Stronger, Luffy answered easily, scrunching his nose up as he remembered the smell of the infirmary. Last question, another repeat. Since your senses were enhanced, have you had an increase in nose problems? Stuffy nose, only smelling out of one side. Anything like that? She asked, getting a head shake from Luffy. Nope, I don't think so. Sometimes smells burn my nose though and give me headaches. Luffy answered. Any smells in particular? She asked curiously. Medicine, and that alcohol stuff, and those smelly salts you used that one time, oh, and antirepic. No, and selenite. No, that wasn't it either, denterpid. Antiseptic, Lou. Sabo interrupted, knowing Luffy would take forever trying to pronounce the word correctly, and wouldn't get any closer to saying it right. Yeah, that stuff. Luffy said with a nod. Whiskey frowned, but Luffy could tell it wasn't because she was mad at them or anything. He could feel a bit of guilt coming from the nurse, making him tilt his head curiously at her. What's wrong? He asked, surprising the nurse who looked up at him instead of down at her papers. Oh, it's nothing, I just feel bad for keeping you in the infirmary. I didn't know it was hurting your nose. Whiskey said in an apologetic tone, only confusing Luffy more. But you didn't know, cause we didn't tell you, Luffy said matter-of-factly, causing Ace to scoff quietly. Yes, however I still feel responsible. Whiskey said. But you're not, cause we are. That's that. Luffy said stubbornly, crossing his arms as he pouted slightly. Whiskey blinked at that before smiling, holding back laughter. I guess you're right, Luffy. Anyways, I think that's all for you, Ace, it's your turn now. She said as she pulled out another new paper, presumably the one meant for Ace. The eldest nodded, not looking excited to talk, but looking willing to nonetheless. I'm just going to go through the same question I went through with your brothers. Again, this happened 5 years ago, so there's that. Can you describe to me what your eyesight is like now compared to how it used to be? Whiskey asked politely, pen at the ready. I can see really far away and I can see in the dark too, Ace answered shortly, though that didn't deter the nurse. Do you know how far away you can see? Whiskey asked, and Ace shrugged. I dunno. Pretty far. Maybe about 15-ish miles. Ace estimated, knowing he could see pretty far away if nothing obstructed his view. And is it with perfect clarity the entire 15 miles, or is it blurrier after a certain point? The head nurse asked. Perfectly clear. Ace said, knowing for a fact that everything was always clear and easy to distinguish. What is it like in the dark? Whiskey asked. Just like it is in the morning. I can see everything perfectly fine, but it's like I'm wearing sunglasses. Like it's tinted, Ace answered. Whiskey wrote this down before continuing. Final question, any eye-related injuries or illnesses since they've been enhanced? She asked, looking up at Ace as she asked the question. I got eye strain a lot, and I got migraines too, but I haven't gotten that in a long time. Ace replied. Whiskey sighed as she wrote the last of the information down. Well, now that that's done, is there anything else? She asked, and Sabo felt bad that they were, probably, overwhelming the nurse with information. It wasn't every day that your new crewmates came with a list of inhuman abilities. Only a couple more things, Miss Whiskey, Sabo said in a slightly apologetic tone. Whiskey nodded, getting ready to write some more. Ace heals at a much faster rate than a normal person. What usually takes weeks to heal will heal within days. Sabo said, and Whiskey had an immediate look of realization on her face as she looked up from her papers. That's why your wound healed so fast. She exclaimed, making Sabo and Luffy laugh while Ace smiled triumphantly. Yes, it is. Also, this one's not as important, but it's proven to become an issue sometimes. Luffy can feel what other people are feeling. If someone is feeling really happy or mad, it can influence Luffy's own feelings, so that he feels the same way, even if he was just fine moments ago. Sabo explained after calming himself down. The only reason I bring this up is that, after being overly influenced by a certain emotion, Luffy became so relaxed by it that he nearly passed out, Sabo said, glancing at Luffy out of the corner of his eye. Whiskey wore a frown as she nodded, jotting the note down. Does this happen with every emotion he feels strongly, or was it just with this certain one? Whiskey asked. Just that one and one more. The first one he explains is a nice, warm feeling that's relaxing, which is why we think he nearly passed out from it. The other emotion isn't a good one, and he describes it as suffocating basically. He's been affected by that one as well, and it caused him to go into a panic attack. Other emotions don't make him like that. Anger will just make him shout and storm off, and happiness will make him giddy and excited. Sabo said. Got it. Is that everything? Whiskey asked, setting her pen down and looking at the brothers. Yes, that's everything, Sabo said with a smile, to which Whiskey smiled back. Well, I'm glad you three told me all of this, it will definitely help in the future. Whiskey said as she put the papers away into a filing cabinet. Sabo and Luffy stood up as Whiskey did. Thank you for listening, Sabo said as the brothers turned to leave the room. He was glad that everything had gone well, glad that Whiskey hadn't pushed to no more. Even though she was a nurse and was, no doubt, curious as to how the brothers had gotten their extra abilities, she hadn't asked and hadn't been mad when the brothers didn't tell. If only all nurses and doctors were like that. Chapter 59. The Welcome Party. The brothers left Whiskey's office and headed straight to the deck without a second thought. Once upon a time, the brothers lurked around the Moby, double-checking their every step and making sure multiple times that no one was following them around. Now, they walked around easily, and even though they still checked to make sure no one was following, it wasn't nearly as often. Walking out onto the deck, they headed over to Whitebeard, noticing that only Jiro and Haruta were by the man. Walking up, the brothers sat in front of him like they had come accustomed to and gave their greetings. "Hey, you guys are done talking with Whiskey," Haruta said with a smile, coming over to sit with the brothers. "We are. We just felt we should update her on a few things," Sabo said to prevent any questions that Haruta may have. "Oh, that makes sense. Hey, do you think you could teach me some of those taps?" Thatch wanted to learn too, but he's stuck in the kitchen cooking the feast for tonight, Haruta said. "Sure, no problem. Do you want to try too, Jiro?" Sabo asked, knowing that all of the commanders would probably want to learn it eventually, so why not try and teach as many as he could now? Sure, why not?" Jiro said as he came to join the group, not really having expected to be included. "Do you mind if I learn as well?" Whitebeard asked, surprising the brothers, but Sabo quickly put on a smile. "The more the merrier. This way more people will be able to understand it," Sabo said. Luffy was smiling brightly as Sabo began reteaching the taps for Be Careful, Haruta and Jiro figuring it out quick enough, after having seen Thatch do it a couple of times. Luffy, without Ace or Sabo noticing, had made his way up Whitebeard's chair, and was now sitting beside the giant's arm. The youngest brother helped Whitebeard, tapping beside the giant's finger to better show him how fast and how many times he needed to tap. Of course, it didn't take long for Ace to notice Luffy was no longer at his side like he had thought when he turned to look at the ocean, but once he saw where he was and what he was doing, the panic went away, and he opted to keep a close eye on his brother. He knew Luffy wouldn't have gotten that close to the man if he sensed any danger, and Whitebeard was someone they trusted. Besides, Luffy had done stuff like this before, but that didn't mean Ace would let his guard down. From where Sabo sat teaching the other two commanders, Ace knew that he had noticed Luffy's disappearance as well, and had also figured out where and what he was doing, but with his hearing, he could hear everything that was happening. So he had no qualms about letting his brother remain where he was. This went on for a little bit, and soon Jiro, Haruta and Whitebeard all knew how to sign the words Be Careful, Be Quiet, and All Good. Jiro had to leave at that point to go take care of something in his division, and Haruta was called over by one of his own division members as well, leaving the brothers with Whitebeard. Luffy was still sitting on the arm of the chair contentedly, and seeing as Whitebeard didn't look like he minded, Ace and Sabo allowed it. "Hi Marco." Luffy chirped happily, waving from where he sat. Ace and Sabo turned to see that the first division commander was walking up to them, holding something in hand. "Hello Luffy, Yuri." Marco greeted, nodding to Ace and Sabo as he reached them. "My son, how's everything?" Whitebeard asked, watching his first mate with a smile. "So far everyone's on task, which isn't saying much, Yuri. Knowing them they'll start slacking off any second now. We're reassigning chores tomorrow, that means you three are getting some as well, Yuri," Marco said, the three brothers nodding in understanding. They had been expecting it for a while now, so it was no surprise to them. "And also, Luffy, you got a letter," Marco said, holding up the object in his hand, showing that it was an envelope. All of the brothers looked confused, because who in the world was sending them a letter? Garp and Shanks would just visit, and anyone on Dawn Island wouldn't know where they were unless Garp told them, but even then, dating wasn't much for letters. There was a slim chance that Makino could have sent it, but even that was unlikely. "Really? Who's it from?" Luffy asked, jumping down from Whitebeard's chair and walking up to Marco, Ace, and Sabo close behind. "Don't know, Yuri. It's only got your name on it," Marco said, handing the envelope over, and the brothers could see that it really only had Luffy's name written on it in clean handwriting. Ace frowned, not sure how he felt about all of this, while Sabo watched cautiously, ready for anything. Luffy shrugged, and even though he was confused, he was also curious. Without any hesitation, Luffy ripped the envelope open, pulling out a folded piece of paper. A letter. Ace and Sabo peered over Luffy's shoulders, reading the words along with Luffy. "Dear Luffy. We've never met before, and that's my fault. All I've ever wanted for you was your safety, but even that isn't something that I was able to guarantee. I thought by sending you off with your grandfather, you would have a better chance of living a normal life. Well, as normal as it can get when someone like Gar praises you. Obviously, I was wrong, and I'm sorry that I couldn't do anything to keep you safer. When I heard you were gone, believe me, I had my men looking everywhere for you and your brothers. Even with all of my resources, though, I was unable to successfully find you and you were lost for 7 years. I will always be thankful that, in the end, you were found and taken out of that situation. Send Whitebeard my thanks for saving you, even if he didn't have a clue who you were. You may or may not know this already, but I am your father. Due to my current profession, I am unable to visit you like I would have hoped to, so instead, I'm sending this letter. You may hate me, or you may not even care about me, but I do care about you, you are my son after all. Inside the envelope, I've sent you a piece of my Viva card with my number on it. Keep it safe, and keep it hidden. Not many have that kind of information, and if it were to get into the wrong hands, many things could be jeopardized. However, just know that, if you ever need my help or anything at all, just give me a call or follow my Viva card, and I will do my best. Being the leader of the revolutionaries means I'm a highly wanted man. It means I have to be careful with everything I do. However, you are my son first and foremost. If you decide to disregard everything in this letter, I understand. A father, Dragon. Ace and Sabo both looked at each other, eyes slightly larger than they had been before. Luffy merely looked confused by the whole thing, but understood now that this was from his father, and it was important. Looking back in the envelope, he saw the Viva card his father had mentioned, pulling it out and briefly noticing the number on it. Without a hint of hesitation, Luffy tucked the paper in the ribbon of his hat, where he kept Shank's Viva card. Man, I didn't think your old man even knew you existed, Ace confessed. After all, Luffy hadn't gotten anything like this before. Garp hadn't even willingly mentioned to them who the boy's father was, it had been an accident. What do you mean? Marco asked, still not knowing who the letter was from. Whitebeard watched from where he sat, not saying anything, but obviously curious as well. It's a letter from Luffy's father. It's just, he's never sent him anything before. They've never met as far as I'm aware. Sabo explained, remembering how confused Luffy had been at the prospect that he even had a father. His father, huh? It's still hard to imagine that Garp managed to even have children, Yuri. Marco said, Ace and Sabo agreeing with him. Whitebeard and Marco knew that the brothers weren't blood-related due to the fact that Ace's father was Goldie. Roger, but they didn't have a clue as to who Sabo and Luffy's parents were. All they knew was that whoever Garp's son was, that was Luffy's father. He says thanks for saving me, Luffy said, looking up at Whitebeard who smiled back at him. It was no problem, Whitebeard answered easily, knowing he would have done it again if given the chance. With that said, Luffy folded the letter back up and put it back in the envelope. Why don't we go put that in our room? Thatch is finishing the feast up now, so by the time we're done we can go eat. Sabo said, and Marco and Whitebeard suddenly remembered the blonde's heightened hearing. That was definitely something that would take some getting used to. I can't wait, there's gonna be so much food. It smells so good. Luffy cheered, a smile suddenly on his face at the mention of the feast, and drool seeping from the corner of his mouth, as the three brothers beginning to walk away. It was weird that the pirates now knew about the brothers' abilities, at least, the commanders and Whitebeard did. Now they didn't have to hide it, they didn't have to keep things they noticed quiet, they weren't forcing themselves to look like normal, defenseless teenagers. The trip to their room was quick, and Luffy put the envelope in the desk drawer, before they headed back out to the deck where, as Sabo predicted, Thatch was announcing that dinner was ready. There were cheers from the crew as everyone made their way into the galley, the brothers waiting for the crowd to die down before walking in. To say it was a feast would be putting it lightly. Food was piled high on platters and plates, everyone taking as much as they could handle without fear of taking too much, because even if every person there took 3 plates, there was still plenty of food for everyone else. The brothers made their way through the excited crew, reaching the commander's table and sitting down quickly. As if on cue, Thatch came up to them, plates filled with an assortment of food in his hands. Here you go, Thatch said, setting the food down in front of them. Luffy beamed, thanking the chef quickly before digging in, Ace doing the same beside him. Sabo laughed, shaking his head, but thanked the chef as well, also beginning to eat. The room was loud and rambunctious for a few minutes as everyone got their plates and settled down, and once that happened, Whitebeard stood, drawing everyone's attention to him. As you all may have realized, there is a reason for this celebration tonight. After a month of staying here on the ship, Ace, Sabo, and Luffy have decided to officially join the crew, and I expect everyone to give them a warm welcome. Whitebeard announced, everyone, cheering happily and shouting warm welcomes to the brothers from where they sat. With that said, let the festivities begin. Whitebeard cheered with a smile, lifting a mug with alcohol in it, Luffy recognizing the smell easily. Everyone in the room cheered again before digging in, chatting loudly with their friends as they did. Drinks were poured and somewhere along the line people began singing cheerfully. Ace and Sabo didn't even bother trying to get Luffy to be careful with how much happiness he let in, because, in a room where everyone was being boisterous and cheerful, it would be impossible for Luffy not to be influenced by it. As expected, within seconds Luffy was wearing an enormous smile, shoveling food into his mouth as fast as his limbs allowed it. The young teen was bouncing slightly in his seat, which made Ace and Sabo laugh. The other commanders noticed the kid's excitement and smiled to themselves, not even thinking that it could be due to Luffy being influenced, thinking he was merely enjoying himself. Even though the brothers were now outed and the commanders now knew about their powers, it still didn't feel real. Even though Luffy knew he could stretch his arm to grab that roll, he didn't because he was still in the mindset that he should avoid using his power at all times. Even though Ace could heat the chicken back up after it began to cool down a bit too much, he stopped himself. Even though the brothers had been using their senses all day, and had mentioned them a few times in front of others, it still wasn't all that natural yet to use the abilities they had in front of others. "So, do you guys think you're gonna get a tattoo?" Blenheim asked suddenly, gesturing to his own tattoo that represented him being a part of the crew. The brothers looked to each other before shrugging. "We don't know, we haven't thought about it," Sabo said truthfully. When they made the decision to join, they hadn't once thought about whether they were going to get a tattoo. They had had much more pressing things on their minds. "It's no big deal if you don't. Besides, it's not like it's a requirement," Curiel said with a reassuring smile, letting the brothers know that they weren't going to be pressured into it. "We'll think about it," Sabo decided, the commanders nodding in understanding. The party continued on, and soon it was moved from the galley and to the deck, everyone carrying their mugs of alcohol with them, and singing joyously into the night. It was getting a bit dark out now, but that didn't stop anyone as a few people left to go bring out instruments. The sky was littered with stars, the moon full and bright, illuminating the dancing pirates. It had been far too long since the brothers had been near people so cheerful and happy. Even back with the bandits, they hadn't been around enough to witness their parties in full swing. They usually only ever came when everyone was already passed out drunk on the floor. Now, however, they were right in the middle of the festivities, and it was clear that Luffy found no issue with it. Whether it was because of the emotions influencing his own, or because he was truly enjoying it, no one would know, but at that moment Ace and Sabo had a sudden realization. For the past year, Luffy had barely been recognizable as the boy who laughed and smiled easily. There had been no trace of the joyous child who ran up to strangers and looked at the world with white innocent eyes. That boy had left after those doctors had forced him to do horrible things. And for that entire year, it was a hassle to get Luffy to even respond to them, much less get him to smile. This past month with the Whitebeards though had changed him. For the better. Where the facility had taken that smile, taken that happy laugh, the Whitebeards brought it back tenfold. Luffy looked as happy as he had when running through the jungle with his older brothers. He looked like that innocent kid who loved anything and everything. It was a harsh contrast to just a month ago, where he had looked lifeless. Emotionless. If this was what the Whitebeards could do, if their baby brother could find his happiness here with these people, then Ace and Sabo were glad they had made the decision to join. "Ace, Sabo, come on, sing too." Luffy laughed out as he sang a horrible off-key rendition of Bing's Sake. Ace and Sabo smiled to each other before relenting and joining their brother in his singing, along with a few other dozens of pirates. Sure, things had started off rough, sure they still had a long ways to go, and sure, the brothers were nowhere near healed yet, but this was definitely a good start. Telling them their past had only been the start, and the journey to properly healing could finally begin. Luffy may leave one day, may go off to make his own crew, and fight for his dream of becoming the next pirate king, but until then, his brothers were going to stay by his side and do everything in their power to keep that smile on his face. Too many days had gone by where they hadn't seen it, and now that it was back, it was something that they were never going to let go of again. Teach could be damned. If that bastard was going to be a part of the same crew as them, they were just going to have to watch him closely like Whitebeard had said. They would keep Luffy away from that man, they would keep that darkness from creeping into their brother, and they would keep any damn Marines trying to take him away from them as far away as they could. Luffy was their precious baby brother, and they were going to do everything in their power as his older brothers to keep him safe. Anyone who had a problem with that would be met with a fist. Chapter 60. Taking the mark. The next morning was slow going for most of the Whitebeard pirates. The festivities of the night before had left them all partying late into the night, and now that they were getting up, they were facing the repercussions of one too many drinks. The brothers, of course, were just fine seeing as they hadn't had any alcohol the night before, and they had gone to bed relatively early in the night compared to everyone else. They may be trying to get used to everyone, but there was no chance that they were going to allow themselves to pass out on the deck like everyone else was doing. Instead, they had gone to their room to sleep, even though Sabo had a bit of a hard time doing that with his enhanced hearing picking up the loud partying out on the deck. Now, however, was a new day. The brothers left their rooms and made their way to the deck where many were still passed out. The few who were up were nursing headaches from their hangovers, and moving sluggishly round, as if it pained them to do so. Whitebeard was sitting in his chair, not looking bothered at all, and Marco stood dutifully at his side, also looking unaffected. Breakfast was being made from what Sabo could hear, so that meant at least a few of the chefs weren't too bad off, Thatch being one of them. It was already a little later in the day than usual for breakfast to still be cooking, but that was alright seeing as most of the crew was still incapacitated. Slowly, one by one, the pirates woke up and headed off to their rooms to get ready for the day, most, if not all, suffering from a hangover as they did so. The brothers only laughed quietly to themselves as they made their way over to the railing by Whitebeard, assuming their normal positions as they did. Marco noticed them quickly and made his way over, and seeing as they were part of the crew now, the brothers felt that they should start getting used to people wanting to come converse with them more. That didn't stop Luffy from doing a quick scan to make sure there was no ill intent in Marco, however. Of course, he didn't expect there to be any. Marco was someone he trusted, but he just wanted to be sure. Good morning, Yuri. Marco greeted as he reached them. Sabo and Luffy both smiled to him, while Ace only watched with a blank face, forcing himself to keep a glare scowl off his face. He was supposed to be trying to make friends, and that meant not scaring them all off like he had been doing. Of course, none of the commanders had ever been deterred by his glares before. Good morning, Marco. Sabo greeted back pleasantly, wondering what the commander would want. How was your first Whitebeard party? Marco asked, turning to look at his ship brothers who were still pulling themselves off the deck floor. Sabo laughed, watching the crew as well. It was definitely interesting, to say the least, Sabo admitted, thinking back to when Rikuyo wanted to do kayak, and had stood on a barrel in an attempt to get higher up, only to end up on his back after the barrel swayed out from under him. Marco smiled, no doubt thinking of many of the other crazy events that had happened last night. That's putting it mildly, Yoi, Marco said in an amused tone. I had fun. Everyone was really happy, and happy feelings are always the best. Luffy said cheerfully, legs swinging as he held onto the railing underneath him. Yeah, you sure let in a lot of happy emotions last night. Ace piped in, sending Luffy a small smile, remembering the boy bouncing round the deck, Ace and Sabo having to chase him down the entire night. I couldn't help it. Luffy laughed, not sounding sorry about it in the least because he wasn't. Ace rolled his eyes but said nothing more. Is it a bad thing to take in too much emotion, Yuri? Marco asked, genuinely curious if they should try and prevent it from happening. It all depends on the emotion really. It's fine if he lets in happiness, it just makes it harder to keep an eye on him, because he likes to run around more. Anger would probably be one of the ones to prevent him from getting too much of. It makes him unpredictable. Really, those are the only emotions he's been overly influenced by besides warmth, but you already know about that one, and darkness. Sabo said with a shrug. When it came to other emotions, they didn't have much experience on how Luffy would react when given too much of something like sadness or maliciousness. Sure, they had been around plenty of those particular emotions in the facility, but Luffy had always done a good job of shutting them out, and focusing solely on Ace and Sabo's emotions. Of course, it helped that at the time there was nothing else for him to focus on, besides keeping the emotions in check. Now, however, he had much more to be worried about, which made him much more susceptible to outside influences. Right, well, let's hope we don't have to worry about that too much, Yoi, Marco said, not wanting Luffy to have any problems with his ability. Especially if it has a possibility of hurting him. As the group talked, the pirates all managed to wake themselves up and disperse, most heading below deck to get ready for the day, while the ones who woke up earlier were back out on the deck. Most looked groggy while there were select few who looked fine. Whether it was because they didn't drink too much or because they could handle alcohol better than the others was unknown. Breakfast is ready. It was nice talking to you, Commander. Sabo said, first addressing his brothers, and then addressing Marco who smiled. It was nice talking to you three too. Oh, and remember, we're reassigning chores for the month today, so you should stay out on deck after breakfast, Yuri. Marco said. Sabo nodded their understanding as the trio got up, heading to the galley seconds before the breakfast bell rang, announcing that food was being served. There was no need to worry about being mobbed trying to get in the galley, seeing as more than half the crew was still trying to get ready. Keyword, trying. Sabo could hear many fumbling with their clothes and shoes, some tripping and falling over in an attempt to put their pants on. Sabo suppressed a smile as he and his brothers sat at the commander's table, taking their usual spots. There was a small trickle of pirates, mostly the commanders, who made their way into the galley. Whitebeard was one of the few to enter, joining the brothers at the table. Thatch came out, holding trays of food as he walked their way. The chef looked relatively alright, but Sabo knew he had seen him taking more than a few drinks the night before. Breakfast passed by quietly, the rest of the crew managing to arrive before it was too late, but no one was up for loud noise or conversation, which was just fine for the brothers. It was odd though because, after all this time of being with the pirates, this was the first time they had all been quiet, save for when they were sleeping. True to his word, Marco announced the new chore list as soon as everyone had finished their breakfast. The brothers had waited patiently on the railing after they had finished eating, and after about an hour, Marco had made the announcement. By then, most of the crew were feeling better, and the lively attitude was picking up again. More chatter and laughter could be heard instead of the painful silence. As expected, the brothers were given chores as well, which was something they intended on doing. Unlike when they lived with Dayton, they felt they should do chores here, if only because they wanted to stay on the pirates' good side. Back when they lived with Dayton, she had tried to make them do chores, but they'd always blown her off, and eventually left completely, for the most part, to live in the forest, so there was no reason for them to do chores. Here, however, they were living for free, and not only that, but they had no doubt cost the crew a lot of money due to their eating habits. The least they could do was some easy chores. At least, that's what they had thought. It soon turned out, though, that Luffy should not be allowed near any chore whatsoever. The brothers had been given the same chores, so they didn't need to split up, which turned out to be a good thing because the first thing they did, washing dishes, made them realize Luffy didn't know a single thing about anything really. The boy had taken the dishes and began washing them in a bucket that had been used to clean the kitchen floor. Sabo noticed quickly and redirected the boy to the sink where he showed him how to properly clean the plate, only. Luffy seemed to have a knack for letting the dishes slip from his hands and nearly break in the sink. After the third time it happened, Ace had gotten frustrated from where he was drying the dishes and made Luffy switch spots with him, so the youngest didn't break anything. Of course, that didn't work either, and now Luffy was dropping the dry dishes. You know what, Luffy, why don't you just stand right there while Ace and I finish this up? Sabo asked with a smile, putting his hands on Luffy's shoulders and guiding him to stand a bit away to make sure he couldn't do any harm. Luffy pouted but did as told. Man, you should have tried doing chores when Dayton asked you to. I bet you would have stopped asking after your first try. Ace mumbled, earning a nudge from Sabo's shoulder. It's not my fault all the dishes were slippery. Luffy whined, folding his arms over his chest. We know that Ace just thinks he's funny, Sabo said as Ace huffed in annoyance. After that, chores went by smoothly. It was found that, with constant supervision, Luffy had no problem swabbing the deck, seeming to actually enjoy the activity if his smile was anything to go by. There were a few times where the boy had nearly slipped, but that's where the constant supervision came in, and Ace or Sabo would be there to catch him. Those were the only two chores they had for the day and would have for most days, and the brothers were a bit bummed when they finished before lunch. The chores had given them something to do other than sit around. It wasn't all that bad though because at least now they were trying to make friends with people and didn't have to be so on guard anymore. As Sabo and Luffy sat on the railing, Ace watched the crew go about their day, his eyes flickering to the tattoos that adorned most members' skin. Not all of their tattoos were visible, and not everyone had them, but the majority were proudly showing off their own mark, symbolizing them as a white-beard pirate. Glancing down at his wrist, Ace narrowed his eyes at his own tattoo, one that he didn't have because he wanted it, one that he was forced to get, one that marked him as a test subject. Flipping his wrist over so he didn't have to see the numbers anymore, Ace looked back at the others' tattoos. Did you guys want to get the white beard tattoo? Ace suddenly piped up, shocking Sabo and Luffy from their cloud gazing. The two turned their heads to look at Ace, Sabo with a raised eyebrow and Luffy with a look of confusion. I don't know, we never really discussed it. I don't think I would be entirely against it though. Sabo replied, not quite sure where his brother was going with the question. If Ace and Sabo got one, I would get one too. They look pretty cool too. Luffy chirped happily, turning to look at the tattoos as well. The eldest was quiet for a minute as he frowned, still staring at the tattoos on his, now crewmate's, skin. Well then, why don't we go get them? There you go, remember, avoid falling in the water for the time being. A white-beard crew member by the name of Percy said. Sabo smiled and thanked the man as he examined his right shoulder where the white beard mark sat proudly in purple permanent ink. Shaheshi, Sabo look, mine's done too. Luffy cheered happily, his shirt off to expose his chest where he also had the same tattoo as Sabo, but his was over his heart. It is. It looks good too. Sabo complimented, turning to look toward their eldest brother who was laying on his stomach, his own tattoo taking more time to complete than theirs. It was nearly done now though, Sabo and Luffy having gotten theirs done a half hour into Ace starting his. His shirt was also off as another crew member, Riley, tattooed across Ace's back, using the same design Sabo and Luffy had used, the skull and crossbones, rather than the simpler cross and crescent. Not only had he had that done, though, but he had also gotten a much simpler tattoo on his arm. Down his arm, he had the letters ASL written vertically, an X going through the S in simple, serif bold letters. Sabo had asked Ace about it, and the eldest had merely brought up the flag design they had used so long ago, the crossbones having been behind the S on the flag, which was why there was an X through the S. It was well known that the brothers had a fear of needles, but the needles used for tattooing didn't bother the brothers in the slightest. Sabo guessed that it was because they knew it would just be ink, or maybe it was because it wasn't a syringe, but whatever the case, the brothers had no issue in sitting still for the tattoo artists. Seems you're all done as well, Ace. Riley announced, wiping the tattoo before Ace began sitting up. Thanks. Ace said simply as Riley held up a mirror, angling it into another mirror, so Ace could see it properly. Looks good. Ace said with a grin, Sabo and Luffy nodding their agreement as they examined the two tattoos. All in all, the brothers were extremely pleased. They had waited until after lunch to do this, but now it was dinner, Ace's tattoo having taken a bit of time to complete, so as the brothers walked out, they saw the deck was empty, the galley as loud as usual during meal times. Ace was still shirtless so as to not irritate the fresh tattoo, Luffy as well, while Sabo was wearing a tank top opposed to his usual long-sleeved shirts for the same reasons. Needless to say, when they walked into the galley, all eyes went to them. Luffy did a good job of ignoring it, whether he meant to or not. He was chatting happily with Ace, a bright smile on his face as he unknowingly showed off the tattoo on his chest. Ace did his best to focus on Luffy, rather than the many eyes on them, while Sabo listened closely to everyone, but also tried looking like he was focused on Luffy's words. All of the brothers knew that their bodies could be a shock to some people, scars and burns littering their chests, and Ace and Luffy were now on display for them. Luffy didn't have a lot of scars seeing as he was rubber, but he had plenty of burn marks covering his chest instead. Ace had scars from both burns and cuts all over his chest, and some on his arms as well, the same going for Sabo, who normally had his arms completely hidden, though now he was showing off the few scars that poked out from his tank top. With that said, the pirates were both shocked by the new tattoos each brother sported, but also the multitude of scars and burns that they hadn't seen before. By the time they got to the table, most had gotten over their shock, and instead everyone was beginning to cheer happily. As they sat, they were given some pats on the back from the commanders, some complimenting them on their tattoos, and others merely smiling in their direction. There were some questions on Ace's tattoo, but Ace merely shrugged them off in favor of eating. "Guess that means you're officially a part of the family now," Haruta said happily, smiling to them. "Guess so. Now you can't get rid of us that easily." Sabo joked back easily, finding that it was becoming much easier to joke around with the commanders. Some laughed at Sabo's words, and conversations started once again, the table going back to normal. The trio was extremely grateful no one brought up their scars, knowing that they may be curious, but they weren't exactly ready to share how they'd gotten every single one of their scars. "Hey, I have a question, and if you don't want to answer that's completely okay. I mean, I'm sure you probably thought about it, but I was just wondering, and I know it's a bit of a sensitive topic, but..." "It's alright Thatch, just ask," Sabo said with a gentle smile to the rambling chef. "Well, it's just that I was wondering, why didn't you cover your numbers? I mean, I understand that you might not have wanted to, but I was just curious." "Again, you don't need to answer if you don't want to," Thatch said, still unsure of if he should have even asked the question. The brothers glanced at each other. They had thought about covering their numbers, and with good reason too. It would have been easy to, and it would save them a lot of trouble later down the road when it came to Marines. "No, it's fine, you're right, we did think about it," Sabo said, all the commanders listening, waiting for an answer. They hadn't thought about the brothers covering their tattoos, but now that Thatch mentioned it, they were curious as well. "But," Atmos asked curiously, prodding Sabo to continue, but understanding if he didn't want to. "But, we didn't. We felt like if we covered them, it would be like pretending what happened there didn't exist. Sure, we could have covered it, but we still have the memories of that place, the memories of all those other children who have these same tattoos on their wrist, and might not be as lucky as us to just cover them up." Sabo explained as he stared at his wrist, his number glaring up at him as if mocking him. "Oh? That makes sense," Thatch said with a nod as he continued eating his dinner, a smile on his face. Sabo smiled back, also returning to his food. Everyone else did the same, no one else saying another word on the subject, because there was no need for any more words, everyone understood. That night, the brothers lay in their beds, all of them feeling their respective tattoos still throbbing on their skin. It was nothing compared to the pain they'd felt back in the facility, and it was almost soothing to them. Grounding even. The mark that showed they were part of something. The mark that showed they were protected. The mark that signified that they had a family. It was a happy reminder that they would now have forever, something that they would always be able to look at and remember they had people who accepted them, past and all. "I'm still gonna become Pirate King one day." Ace and Sabo both laughed at their little brother's words, Ace ruffling the youngest's hair, while Sabo patted Luffy's hand with his own. "We believe you, Lou." Well guys, that is it for now. Make sure to like and subscribe for a cookie and join the Discord if you want. Anyway, see you guys later.